there was a very politically useful narrative that the Russians were fighting for Donald Trump to win the 2016 election, and that turns out to not be true, and the FBI knew that a long time ago.
This is Curtis Fox. He's a former Green Beret who has now dedicated his life to researching and analyzing Russian military strategy.
The Russians really stepped on their crank when they invaded Ukraine. Zelensky's presidency was on the rocks. The Russians created that monster.
They made a war hero.
That's a great way to say it, a living martyr.
That's right. There are very few people that know the Russian military better than this guy. And today, he's going to take us through everything.
To create riots and public displays of displeasure, they used the Night Wolves biker gang, of which Putin is a member.
Putin is a member of a biker gang?
Yeah.
He explains Russia's hybrid warfare tactics, using a mixture of chaos, propaganda, and ethnic division to successfully conquer their enemies.
They start slowly surging in assets into Southwest Asia and Abkhazia to train these local militias, and then they start doing exercises on the northern border, and then they start needling the Georgians.
I'll be honest, I didn't know a ton about Russian military strategy. I mean, I understood that Russia invaded Ukraine and that they also tried to beat up Rocky, I guess. But other than that, I didn't know anything. But after this episode of my conversation with Curtis, I feel like I know much more why the Russian military is doing what they're doing, what Vladimir Putin's ultimate plan is, and how we as Americans are just as susceptible to the same propaganda and chaos hybrid warfare strategy as any other country. So, without further ado, zip up your tents, get cozy in your little sleeping bag, and enjoy Curtis Fox. Welcome to camp. Curtis Fox.
Good morning.
How are you, brother?
I'm gonna make it. How are you?
I'm doing excellent, man. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I'm really excited to talk. There's all sorts of crazy things happening in the world. One part of the world specifically, all right? We are pretty close, some would say, I've heard, to, getting some nuclear threats from Putin and from the Russian state. There's, again, some random headlines that I've read. There's prisoner exchanges going on. There's all sorts of wild hybridized warfare that you've discussed and written about in your book. So I'm curious, as an American, as someone that loves America, how do we defend ourselves from the hybridized and futuristic warfare technologies coming from Russia? What do we do?
That is there's no easy answer to that. I would tell you when you start to understand the Russian methodology, and this is what they do in hybrid warfare, and let's say in Russian grand strategy, is it's something that they've repeated, throughout their history. The tactics that are used, presently under the Putin regime would be very familiar to Catherine the Great or Peter the Great.
All the way back.
Yeah, Lenin and Stalin. It doesn't really matter which regime is governing in Moscow. Their strategic paradigm is their strategic paradigm. They operate under, let's say, maybe the right term is political warfare. They operate beneath the threshold of overt conventional war to try to move the ball forward in the margins wherever possible. And when you do that over 200 years, you can really advance the lines and grab the things that you need to grab.
Yeah, you can create a little rolling occupation, so to speak.
Right. They what they would like to be able to get is a certain defense in depth. What they're after is hard geographic barriers.
And this has been going on since Catherine?
Oh, Peter the Great, and even before that.
Oh, wow. And this has always been a feature of sort of Russian military strategy because of the geography that they're sort of dealt?
Yes. So they don't have any natural boundaries. They're the world's largest country, and the Rus ethnicity is located on the vast northern Eurasian steppe. And so they have they have nothing that they can do to achieve security except to expand and grow out. And in the 13th century, that meant Rus tribes clashing with the tribes around them, and then eventually conquering them and subsuming them into their ranks.
The Mongols, right?
Yeah,
these damn Mongols.
And Putin gave a very interesting interview with Tucker Carlson, a few months back, where he lays this out, and he talks about how Russia and Ukraine have been intertwined since the 8th century.
Yeah, which I actually think a lot of people watched that and they were like, That's not what Tucker asked. Why is he going on this long soliloquy about ancient Russian history? But I think that it is actually intrinsic to understanding his position and just the Russian sensibility when understanding the geographical implications of how the country is actually laid out. They have a huge vulnerability to the West. So if you put yourself in his shoes, you're like, oh, okay. I mean, from north and south, they've expanded so far. You have a little bit of, mountainous kind of protection. And then on the east side, you have a coast, and that gives you, obviously, unless someone's going to do some type of beach landing on a hostile shore, which is pretty tough. But to the west, you just got sort of flat land going all the way into Western Europe. And that could potentially raise a problem as we look through history. I mean, Russia's been invaded every 60 years on the dot since the beginning of time. You know what I mean? Like, whether it's Hitler or whether it's, Napoleon, or whether it's, some would say, NATO expansion, into the region. So you can kind of see his perspective where you're like, oh, there has been a lot of expansionist ideals through this very fertile and flat plain directly into, Stalingrad. I don't know. I can see his perspective.
And
am I being overly sympathetic here? Am I a Putin sympathizer?
I think you're grasping the paradigm. The thing I would point out is that I would love to be able to create some sort of a grand detente with them. The problem is that there's not really a whole lot of middle ground. What the Russians really want is to be back where they were in 1945. The strategy I said that Peter the Great and Catherine the Great and Lenin and Stalin were all pursuing. Stalin hit the apogee of that strategy at the end of World War II. He had 300 divisions, ground forces of about 13 million men. And the vast majority of that was forward stationed in East Germany. And so they were on the western side of the Fulda Gap. And they controlled all of the entryways into Russia, whether that was through the Caucasus Mountains. They pushed out to the Gobi Desert.
Oh, wow.
They've pushed out against the Carpathian Mountains.
So when you say 45, you're not saying Soviet states. You're saying occupation all the way up to East Germany.
All the way up to East Germany. What we would consider what was called the Warsaw Pact, which was a counterbalance to NATO.
Wow.
So every one of those Eastern European countries had an authoritarian socialist regime imposed on them once the Soviets liberated them from Nazi occupation. And if you give them that and you let them forward station not just heavy ground forces but tactical nuclear ordnance in East Germany, then they tend to relax, and that's what they consider acceptable defense in depth.
I don't know if they'll ever get that defense in depth without some bloodshed. I can't imagine
that's a fact.
I can't imagine the East Germans and then the Poles and the Ukrainians. I can't see them just being like, all right, you guys can have it back.
So this is I just published a paper in Military Review called "Who in NATO is Ready for War." And the short answer is only Turkey and Poland. Outside of the United States, most of our European allies are grossly underprepared for any sort of real conflict. But the Poles are kind of looking at this, and they've been dominated by Germany and Russia in different forms for the last 400 years.
Tough neighborhood for the Poles.
Tough neighborhood. That's a great way to say it. And the moment Russia went into Ukraine, they decided they were not screwing around. And the Poles have expanded to a 6-division army, which makes them the most powerful ground forces in Europe.
Wow.
So the Poles can field more in terms of, sheer combat power on the ground than the Germans and the French put together.
Wow. I had no idea.
Yeah. So Germany and France are both fielding 3-division militaries or 3-division armies. And so are the British. But the Poles, they are not going to, after systematic extermination under the Nazis and then 50 years of slavery under communism, they are never going to allow themselves to be dominated by either of those powers again.
Yeah. There's going to be no more like, oh, Churchill's going to help us out. You know what I mean? None of this old rely on the British. They'll come in. Yeah, they've been burned by that before. If I'm Poland, I'm not going to be like that whole Churchill thing. I think was actually maybe it was Chamberlain at the time.
Yeah.
But I think that whole Chamberlain thing, I think was that would have left a bad taste in my mouth. Like, oh yeah, we're going to rely on the British to help us out, and the British are like, well, we'll let you guys get around a little bit, and then we'll step in a little later. I don't know. I feel bad for the Poles, and I get their position.
you're kind of putting your finger on how to confront hybrid warfare too as well, because you might think of these tactics in the way that Adolf Hitler seized territory for Greater Germany prior to the actual outbreak of World War II as a very similar strategy. He makes territorial claims, in the Saarland. He makes territorial claims in the Sudetenland. These are the German-speaking regions of Czechoslovakia. And the Nazi Party is setting up very, very strong satellite arms in Austria. And then, he goes into Austria to give speeches and rallies, and there's basically a quiet coup, and the entire government in Austria collapses, and everybody wakes up the next day and finds out that they're a part of Germany now. And, with the Sudetenland and Czechoslovakia, Chamberlain, that was his famous peace in our time deal. So we'll let you have the Sudetenland if you'll promise to make no more territorial claims in Europe. Well, the moment that they make that agreement and Chamberlain brings back home peace in our time, Hitler and the Nazis don't just take the Sudetenland, they just annex the rest of Czechoslovakia, and the Brits stick their head under a rug and pretend that doesn't happen.
Right.
And Churchill is the one that's thundering about it in Parliament. The famous line is, "You had the choice between peace and war, and you had the choice between dishonor and war. You chose dishonor, and you will have war."
A bar.
Yeah,
I mean, that's awesome.
And the Poles were the last straw, and the Poles were, they were, if you make territorial claims in Poland, we're going to war.
Mm-hmm.
And he did, and he invaded Poland, and the term the Germans used about the French and British response was Sitzkrieg.
Sitzkrieg is hilarious.
Yeah, which means they did nothing. So they all said they were at war, and the British and French, they've just got these horrific memories of World War I and the Battle of the Somme and Verdun, right, where just millions of young men are snuffed out in these exchanges. And so they're reluctant to get into the fight. And so the Germans use the operational space to just annex Poland in a matter of weeks.
Wow. And do you think there's analogs from this sort of World War II expansionist idea from Hitler that we could see happening in the East with Russia now?
Absolutely.
And what are the analogs?
Well, it's similar territorial claims. They make points of, okay, we've got an entwined history with Ukraine, for example, which is true. They do.
Mm-hmm. But Germany also had an entwined history with, the Austrians.
That doesn't mean, that doesn't, just because you speak the same language doesn't mean you can just throw their government away.
But that does seem to be like a strategic element, like I forget exactly. I think Stalin had done this after World War II, but intentionally displaced Russian-speaking like Serbs and like put them into different countries and sort of move them around in order to have actual Russian speakers in different nations so that they would have some type of, tacit emotional connection back to the Russian motherland despite being of different nation states.
Absolutely. That's yes. And no one has ever, other than maybe Mao, no one has ever really attempted social engineering on the scale of the communists in the Soviet Union. Mao would give them a good run for their money. But yeah, Stalin absolutely did things like that. And he didn't just move ethnic-speaking Russians to places, let's say like Azerbaijan, which is an ethnically Turkish country. Well, we need them to know that they're Russian and they're tied to Moscow. So we're going to move a bunch of Russian-speaking people in there to, impose our culture over top of them, so to speak. Mm-hmm. The other thing that Stalin did was he saw certain ethnicities as threats to the larger war effort in World War II and to the communist regime in Moscow. So for the Chechens, he deported something like 400,000 Chechens, sent them all to Siberia. And so like the entire male Chechen population was sent to Siberia to work in gulags, and they weren't allowed to come back until Stalin died. I want to say Khrushchev is the one that allowed them to come back.
If you're like me, you probably read a news story and you're like, this is crazy. What is the truth about this? Is this a partisan spin? Is this funded by some media company or some country by their state-sponsored media to try to warp my brain? I genuinely read news articles now with so much skepticism because I have no idea if this is from the right or the left and what the agenda is and why it's being presented in front of me. And that is why I follow and support Ground News. That's right. So even before I started working with this company on the podcast, I've been following them on Instagram because I just thought they gave a very, very great, unbiased, nonpartisan approach to media. It's awesome. Basically, you're going to get a headline and they will show you sort of the different media splits as it comes to understanding the story. They will compare the reporting from different outlets across the political spectrum in one place to show you how the framing and word choice can affect our understanding of a story. I mean, here's a story that my mom sent me from a couple months ago. Robberies, assaults surge in Central Park, leaving New Yorkers and NYC tourists terrified. What is the purpose of this story? Who is writing it? Where is it coming from? Now I can go to Ground News, read this headline, and be able to make an assessment as to whether or not this is predominantly being reported by the right wing or by the left wing, and make some type of deduction like, oh, this is actually being used, as some sort of political apparatus. So if you're like me, if you're a truth seeker, if you're trying to find unbiased news, I would absolutely recommend Ground News. It is completely independent, nonpartisan, subscriber funded. It allows readers to think critically about the world around them, and it doesn't tell them what to think, but instead lets them think for themselves. And ultimately, it avoids misinformation and tries to heal polarization within our country, which I think is absolutely amazing. So don't let misinformation and sensationalism influence how you think. Save a massive 50% on Ground News' top tier Vantage plan with my link, ground.news/Gagnon, Gagnon, or scan my QR code right here, or go to the description and click on the link. This unlocks access to all of their news analysis features, something that I think is, super important to have. Yeah, make decisions based on facts, not spin. Check them out. Let's get back to the show. It's actually very similar to China. Now that you're putting it in these terms, like didn't Mao move like all the Han sort of dynastic Chinese people across the whole country, and then basically Muslim Chinese Uyghurs kind of like push them into their own little pocket in their own little city, in the same way that the Russians kind of saw these Muslim Chechens and kind of pushed them into Serbia. It's almost a one for one. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah. That's a domain of history I actually want to do some real research on. But yeah, essentially that's exactly what Mao did. He had a peasant army of Han Chinese. And the narrative under communism is we're freeing ourselves from oppression. And the oppression in the classical Marxist sense is economic oppression, but you can convey that very easily into social oppression of some kind. And when you have these different ethnicities that have, they've been at odds with each other in many ways. Sometimes they work together, sometimes they don't. Marxism gives you a very convenient power-based narrative for because in Marxism, that's how everything works, is it's all a power dynamic. You and I aren't having a conversation to try to reach some sort of a mutual understanding. It's a power game between you and me to try to figure out who's going to take the upper hand, and whatever logic and rhetoric we employ is simply in service of this. There's no enlightened self-interest. It's just self-interest.
So we can sort of, oppress, borderline enslave, depending on the definition, an ethnically disenfranchised group of Muslims because it's at the benefit of the class struggle.
Yes.
Yeah,
that's a very apt way of putting it.
If any other circumstance, you'd be like, hey, should we oppress a minority religious group in our country? People would be like, no. But if it's for the sake of, preserving the class struggle and, seizing the means of production, all of a sudden you're like, wait a second, let's oppress them.
That's a very good way to put it.
Yeah, it's a shame that you can really justify a lot of evils of man by seeking the greater good.
And, Hitler couched, we consider Hitler to be on the right, where communism is an authoritarian left ideology. But Hitler too, first off, Hitler was a devout socialist, right? That's what Nazi is, the National Socialist Party, right? So, right and left, these are terms that we're kind of playing with a little too loosely, I think. But he couched almost everything that he did in terms of, the systematic purging of, let's say, homosexuals, Jews, gypsies, pretty much anybody that didn't fit the Aryan narrative. He couched all that in oppression. These, and it's fascinating. If you actually examine the 1930s rhetoric leading up to, things like Kristallnacht, the Jews are attacked in Nazi rhetoric almost as though because they are in a certain sense a privileged upper class. Like if you kind of think about how Jewish communities have survived in Europe throughout the centuries, right? Like they've always had their own kind of autonomous communities that have their own cultural norms. And no one goes to church on Sunday. We're going to the synagogue on the Sabbath.
Mm-hmm. In a very insular community, right?
Yeah.
Like if you don't have a nation to call home, whatever nation you're now exiled into, you're going to become very close and bonded very tightly with.
That's yes. And it's, and those communities are successful in a lot of ways, first because their culture imposes self-discipline. It insists on on strong education for their children. And it creates a very tight-knit family unit, not just around a nuclear family, but around an extended family of aunts and uncles and grandparents that are all setting expectations for how the children are going to perform and behave. And so, it's no surprise that when Adolf Hitler is arguing for, the parasites, we've got to arrest and expel the parasites in our communities, he's in the terms of the Jews, he's talking about all the bankers, all the jewelers, all the business owners. In the university system, he's talking about all the Nobel Prize winners. These are this is a segmented off aristocracy. And he's basically arguing for, in a lot of cases, for arresting an upper class segment, seizing their wealth, and then putting that to use in service of the larger public.
Right.
And there's a very Marxist element to that.
Yeah, which is an interesting thing. I just read about this recently, so I don't know enough about it to make the comparison, but I noticed the same thing happened in Uganda under Idi Amin.
Mm-hmm.
Almost the same exact thing, where basically he comes into power as a dictator of Uganda and says the upper class of our country is almost the same exact language. And like they've infiltrated, they're parasitic, and they need to all get out. And they weren't, Jewish people or some other type of like a religious ethnic group that was living. It was largely like Southeast Asian. So it was like Pakistani and Indian. And they were running all of like the stores. They were, dealing often in like the financial sectors, and they were like extremely wealthy in that part of Uganda at that time. And overnight, they all had to leave. Literally, there was like an ordinance by like Tuesday, the 5th, if you're not out of the country, you're going to be imprisoned or killed. And all of them had to flee. And so there's thousands and thousands of the wealthy, well-to-do centers of the community that then all of a sudden have to leave. And then as a result, it really leaves like a labor vacuum in the nation as a consequence of that.
And I'm sure a capital vacuum.
Exactly. But it's one of these things where it's like, yeah, when people come into power, they look at who they can blame. Mm-hmm. And if there is some type of, other that they can, cast the blame onto that, is, somewhat successful within the nation, they'll do it seems like every time.
So this is probably a good time to bring it up. So, I'm doing research on my next book right now. And it's a detailed analysis of the French Revolution, which, is, that's maybe the first major revolution that explores exactly the ideas that you're talking about in Uganda, right? Mm-hmm. This is the oppressed people that are throwing off the shackles and chains of convention and tradition and aristocracy, and we're creating a republic to be for us. And there's elements of that are true, but it absolutely becomes unhinged and comes off the rails. Like they try to set up a constitutional monarchy in the British model under the Constitution of 1791. And the most extreme radicals that had really pushed, the rhetoric and mobilized the public against King Louis, decide that first off, they're not at the negotiating table and they can't get the policy that they want through the new regime. So they basically find ways to destabilize the new government and overthrow the regime. I would love to dive into the French Revolution. It's not really a conversation for today, but
when the book comes out, you'll come back on and we're going to get into it.
I would love it.
Yeah.
But the thing to point out of this is that the French Revolution and the mass executions that happen under the Reign of Terror are shockingly similar to the Holocaust.
Wow.
And both the French Revolution and the Holocaust are very good examples of what happens when psychopaths, and I mean that in a clinically diagnosable way, like psychopaths are an ineradicable percentage of the population. And we can talk about that under the Big Five personality model and what psychopaths clinically are. But there is a point where if they seize public office and they get enough of them into public office, they start to do things like mass executions, and they always couch it in this very righteous rhetoric to kind of conceal who and what they are and what their intentions are.
Wow. That's an interesting idea. I've never heard the comparison between French Revolution and any type of modern genocide. That's interesting.
And man, it is a soul-wrenching amount of research to do on mass executions.
Yeah.
But
you got to go play with like a puppy after that. It wears on you a little, I can imagine.
I work on it in about 30-minute segments.
Yeah, that's probably all you should do. Yeah, or else your brain will start to go.
I tell you what, it's a dark experiment but it's probably a necessary experiment. It's one we don't do in our education system at all to help people, young men especially, but people that are growing up and they're in their teenage years, to understand how you could absolutely have been a guard at Auschwitz.
Right.
And that's within your character, and you just haven't been put in a position where you've had to make those choices. Everybody wants to pretend that they'll be the guy that hides Anne Frank in his attic.
Yeah.
But the reality is that those people are actually rare.
Yeah.
And there's a good moral goal to try to be that person. But, the evidence suggests that, the vast majority of us are not quite that good.
Yeah. And I think it's also important to note that these atrocities of history are not necessarily, sort of vanquished to history, right? Like these things could happen again. Obviously, like if you have Jewish friends, they'll remind you that the mantra of the Holocaust is, never again. Mm-hmm. And I think that is an apt mantra because I don't think this will be the last, ethnic cleansing event in history, unfortunately. And I think having an awareness that, these things could happen again in some capacity, maybe in a different nation or at a different time, but it probably likely will happen again in some sense. Some could even argue it's happening now in different civil wars that are, breaking out across the world that, again, would be a combo for a different time. But all that to say, these events have persisted throughout history, and young men and women will be at that crossroads where they're going to be like, wait, do I represent my nation and, support the military force that I'm sort of conscribed to? Or do I stand up for what is moral and ethically right and, stop the, destruction of an entire group of people in my country?
Especially if it's going to cost you everything that you have and everything that you could have.
Yeah, you put your life on the line. And it's a very real decision that many people in history have had to make. And again, some would argue that there's young men in Russia that are making that decision now and, some extent. So I'm curious, circling back onto the Russian idea, can you describe what exactly hybridized warfare is and how that's playing out now and why that term is being used and how this conflict is different than previous conflicts with Russia?
Sure. So I've talked about, let's say the Russian grand strategy, the strategic picture. To really understand hybrid warfare, you have to understand the strategic picture, and those gains is what they're pursuing. And then at the operational level and the tactical level, what hybrid warfare is it's a methodology and a sequence of tools that they might use to make those gains, let's say to push their outer boundaries out without the horrible expenditure of personnel and resources that would normally accompany a conventional war. So in the book, what I use to illustrate this is the Second Chechen War, requires the Russians to dedicate very serious combat power to Chechnya. It's very taxing in terms of the number of casualties that they take. It's very expensive. They can set up a steamroller and then slow walk that steamroller in a World War II style, across, a province like Chechnya, and pacify it. But especially in the 90s, we have mass communications by that point, and the world is kind of watching in horror as, what is a very brutal slogging match and ethnic cleansing happens in Chechnya. And the Chechens are they're ruthless in a way that no one else is. They'll get right down to the Russians' level, and I mean, they have no problem, getting their hands dirty, so to speak.
Yeah, these are tough motherfuckers.
These are tough people. These are the guys that come out of Chechnya and they teach Al Qaeda operatives how to do sniper operations and stuff. Yeah, they are some dangerous people.
They also fuck up people in the UFC.
Yeah,
you notice that. You know what I mean? Like, those are the nice ones, bro. Those are the ones that are like, yeah, I don't want to kill people. I just want to hurt them. Yeah. You know what I mean? And those are the scariest guys in the world.
I don't want to kill people. I just want to choke them.
Yeah, you got to think like those are like the pacifistic Chechens. That's scary.
So when we get into Russian soft a little bit later, I'll tell you about one of history's more brutal hostage rescues to kind of bracket, what the Russians are willing to do in terms of extremism in that part of the world. But with hybrid warfare. At the operational level, they're employing targeted propaganda. They're using economic sanctions and financial sanctions. They will manipulate their oil and gas exports and their gas pipelines to try to coerce and antagonize a country, let's say Ukraine, into remaining in Moscow's circle. And that can come in the form of debt diplomacy, and that can come in the form of, let's say, revising your natural gas contracts to give you a preferred deal. But if you're going to move away from us, then all of a sudden we want you to pay for your gas up front, and you can't buy any of it on credit.
Which was a smart strategy, I would say, to the Russians to create such a fuel dependence. You know, I mean, all of Western Europe, for the most part, I mean, with varying degrees, the farther out you get, has a real reliance on Russia, or at least used to, for fuel and gas.
So I'm going to blow your mind for a second here.
Please.
So I don't want to imply that they're connected now. That's not fair. But the green movements, the anti-nuclear branches of the green movements, both in the Europe and the United States, were both founded with KGB seed money in the 1960s.
Wow.
The Russians realized that in order to do global trade, with any of their industries, and the Soviet Union had almost no service economy, but they were very, very good in state planning at doing the heavy industrial work. And so to interface with the rest of the world, that was what they could offer in the supply chain. But to trade with the rest of the world, you need hard currency and a reserve currency, right? Well, you get that through oil and gas exports. And so, they realized as nuclear energy was becoming, the next thing in the West, and we've got the first generation and second generation nuclear reactors coming online, and they realized that could be a threat to their oil and gas networks. So the KGB founded with, they were the ones that provided the seed money to start the anti-nuclear components of the green movements in both Europe and the United States.
That is wild.
And so it's so funny now when you hear these activists, fighting, we've got to stop carbon emissions because it's going to kill us all. Like climate change is, the climate catastrophe is going to kill us all. We've got a mature technology and nuclear energy that can be plugged in almost anywhere where there's a coal-fired power plant, and the grid in the United States and Europe is already perfectly set up to harness, third generation and fourth generation nuclear reactors. And the cherry on top is that a simple Rubik's Cube size of uranium or plutonium holds enough energy to supply my energy needs or your energy needs literally for the rest of our lives. And it is true that there is nuclear waste that's produced as a byproduct with using nuclear fuel, but all of that remains self-contained at the nuclear power plant, right? With any carbon-based fuel, the pollution is, it's spread, through the environment. And we try to spread it out as much as we can so it doesn't become too concentrated. It is not a perfect solution. There are downsides to nuclear energy, but if you wanted to, but the French were running 80% of their power grid on nuclear energy. The Russians they use tons of nuclear plants.
Wow. But they're exporting, oil and gas that they drill out of the ground because that is the natural resource that they have.
That's one of many commodities that they have that the world needs.
Wow. So you got to wonder, there's so many people that are probably, pushing this anti-nuclear energy idea, or at least definitely were probably earlier on in like the 90s, I imagine, just at the behest of, Russian propaganda without even knowing it, just useful idiots that are pushing this idea. I mean, what a crazy thing.
I mean, they make for easy targets, right? When people go out and they wave placards at things and they're all courage and all courage and heart. And, you just have to give them the cause to fight for. I mean, kids below the age of 22 have this messianic complex that they need to save the world, and you just got to give them a cause. And
wow. I mean, that's just really smart from the Russian intelligence perspective. I mean, being able to see that on the horizon and being like, okay, how do we subvert this narrative? Nuclear energy is not the future. It's actually going to be the destruction of the planet. It's going to lead to nuclear fallout, et cetera, et cetera.
Yep.
Wow.
And it just takes a few disasters. 3 Mile Island, that was a problem, but I mean, we've had changes in nuclear engineering that have ensured that their reactors are fail safe now. That 3 Mile Island can never happen again in a modern nuclear plant, but the public doesn't know that, and they don't get into the details.
And there's probably a decent amount of money pushed behind the idea that it could happen again very easily.
And it doesn't have to be pushed by the Russians anymore. I mean, these movements are self-funded.
Right.
They're 50C3s.
After you get them going.
501c3s,
Wow. I mean, that is just, it makes you wonder about everything though, right? Like if there's someone that can benefit from some type of political message, you got to wonder, like, are they involved in it somehow?
Yep.
And now is this the KGB seed money in this, certain sections of this movement, guarantee like 100%, or is that like still somewhat of a rumor, quasi conspiracy, or is that on the books?
No, we know they did it. It's on the books.
Wow.
To defend, I don't want to slander these people too much, but they don't have any connection with Russia today.
Sure.
But I mean, this is what the KGB did for a very long time. There's the Marxist elements in the American higher education, in the university system. There are a number of universities, and you've heard of the term's escaping my brain right now. But a lot of these people, these European intellectuals that fled Europe during World War II and stuff, and came to American universities and set up shop. A lot of the Marxists that came to the United States were funded with KGB money, and there were principal universities in the United States, including Harvard and UPenn and Columbia and Yale. The Yale Humanities Department was a big one. And, the KGB would, fund people to come over and set up shop. And, I think, anyway, it's,
wow.
That's how that was their way of ideologically subverting the American system. And, there was a reason the FBI was so eager to monitor Marxist students for so long.
And it's not unlike even what happened in 2016, right, with the election. I mean, the Russian finances going into paying for social media ads and paying doing paid social to try to influence the election. I think it's kind of like clear to say that Trump didn't collude with the Russians to get elected, but it does seem like the Russians or certain vested areas of the Russian government were putting money into trying to get one specific candidate elected.
Well, so here is again where the public was kind of misled by the American government for a long time. And this is a good component of hybrid warfare, right? Like this is part of the Russian grand strategy. You listed some of the events, the Russians have had to deal with, whether it was the invasion in 1941 by the Wehrmacht or the Grande Armée under Napoleon. Like they want to prevent grand coalitions from ever being able to march eastward. And so they're very good at disrupting political consensus. In the case of the 2016 election, the FBI now has very grudgingly conceded and the CIA have very grudgingly conceded that they weren't trying to promote Hillary Clinton. They weren't trying to promote Donald Trump. They were trying to disrupt all parties. They were trying to. They saw in Donald Trump. They wanted Hillary Clinton to win because they saw in Donald Trump everything that we see in Donald Trump. He's chaotic. He's unpredictable. If you're Russia and you're trying to set policy and you're trying to figure out how it is that you're going to confront and move around the U.S. government, you need somebody who in the White House is a known quantity. And so they wanted Hillary Clinton to win. Now, what they were doing in social media, for the most part, was, if Black Lives Matter sets up a rally, then maybe we'll ensure that there's a MAGA rally that accidentally happens at the same time in the same place. Mm-hmm. And if we want to sow as much evil, let's say, opposition information about all the candidates as possible to try to, and we'll target those messages to the right people to create a little bit more outrage and turn up the temperature in the discourse. It's not really obvious that they moved the needle in any direction, but this is stuff they do in Europe all the time. And we don't talk about it because it's not on the American radar. But the FBI concealed that. And the CIA concealed that from the American public. It didn't really come out until about 2022 that, because there was a very politically useful narrative that the Russians were fighting for Donald Trump to win the 2016 election. And that turns out to not be true. And the FBI knew that, and they knew that a long time ago.
Wow.
And that's a frustrating thing.
Yeah, it makes sense. Again, I don't think that any one of these nations has like any vested interest. Again, I think the narrative is kind of pointed out like, oh, Putin and Trump are boys and they're calling each other and he's a puppet of Putin. Like, again, I think all of that is bullshit. I just think sowing dissent and, in the words of Abraham Lincoln and, probably many people before that, a house divided can't stand. So just creating some type of internal dissent where people are at each other's necks is ultimately at the benefit of...
And that's exactly the way the Russians perceive it.
Yeah, and I think it's completely right. I mean, the more dissent and conflict you can sow within a populace, I mean, they can't go anywhere.
And this is a core component of how they manage at the operational level in hybrid warfare. This is how they managed Kiev and Ukraine for a very long time. So let's say 2004, there was they called it the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, where, there was reformist candidate for president and reformist prime minister, and they were running against the Russian puppet candidate. And they won. And so first off, the Russians, I think they poisoned the guy. He didn't die, but he was very sick for a while. They basically bribed everyone in Ukrainian parliament to try to freeze most of the reform legislation in place. And they just froze the legislature with blackmail, bribery.
Is this the dude that they poisoned and like his skin all like changed or something? I forget who this was.
Oh man, what was the guy's name? The prime minister's Yulia Tymoshenko, but the president's name was...
He didn't die from the poison, right?
No, I think you're thinking of Sergei Skripal, which was 2017. That was in the UK.
Oh, that was recent. Oh, yeah. I thought that was from back then.
So they poisoned this president. He didn't die, and then they were finally able to have a presidential election again in 2010, but this time the Russians really took it seriously, and their candidate, Viktor Yanukovych, won. And that's what sets us on course for the Ukrainians call it the revolution of dignity. But it's effectively they overthrow the government. There's the Euromaidan protest because Yanukovych wants to pivot towards Europe, and so the Russians they're leaning on him heavily not to do that, and because he does owe his presidency to them, but he's just reading the tea leaves with the Ukrainian people. And so he promises all these reforms and, we're going to file for entry into the European Union. And then Moscow leans on him and he backtracks on all that stuff, and it creates these riots. And then to put down these protests, he becomes very, very heavy-handed, and he deploys police forces en masse and kills hundreds of his own people to try to put it down. And then he loses his nerve and he has to flee to Russia. The GRU, a couple of GRU officers are sent to extract him.
Wow.
And so he flees to Russia, and that's what sets up the Crimean annexation. So if you look, from Vladimir Putin's perspective, he claims that it was all orchestrated by the CIA, and he that's what he tells everybody. The CIA overthrew a democratically elected government, and this guy is now leading a government in exile in Russia, and that's what set this crisis off. It was the CIA's fault. And the reality is, first off, the CIA is not that competent. They're good at some things, but they're quite, American intelligence is quite risk averse. We generally have a consensus that we created an enormous amount of backlash against the United States by involving ourselves in foreign politics and Latin America, Iran, Cuba. I mean, pick the regime change. There's a general consensus in the intelligence community that those were not, good for our country in the long run, and they didn't yield fruit, and we shouldn't involve ourselves in stuff like that. And the notion that the CIA, could have or would have overthrown the government in Kiev and then orchestrated this movement out of thin air is it's farcical.
At this point, you don't think the CIA is conducting like color revolutions or like coup d'etats?
No.
And when do you think that ended?
I don't know if the ending is the right word.
Pivoted?
Yeah, I would say risk averse is the right word. There's a really, I need to do a deep dive on this. But my perception of the CIA, most of that I get from my friends in the State Department who interact with them on a regular basis. And it's that at some point, it used to be a relatively, I don't know, I guess you would say conservative, very nationalist organization. And at some point, due to who they were recruiting out of American university systems, they started becoming very liberal. And, the State Department has always been known as being a very liberal, component of the U.S. government. And they have interactions now with CIA officers where they're like, ooh, reel that in a little bit. And so it's some of the texture of the organization in terms of, I don't know how else to say this. They just don't see that we have a moral right to interfere in other countries, and I think that's becoming fairly well institutionalized in the CIA. And some of those changes are healthy, and some of them are not. And we have to be strong enough to advocate for our national interest. At the same time, coup d'etat is not something that the CIA is up to at present.
Yeah,
it could come back.
I wonder if after like Saddam, I wonder if that was like the turning point where it was like, oh, this is becoming a real issue.
Could be. That seems probable. I mean, it was a big, the Iraq War was a big turning point for a lot of the U.S. government.
Yeah.
Who knows? If I ever get a job in the CIA, I can call you and tell you all about it.
I don't think you should do that. I don't want to be on the record. I don't want to be on the record of getting secret leaks from the CIA. I am cool with the CIA, right? You and I, we're friends, okay? I don't want to be a patsy one of these days. I just feel like it's going to happen. I don't know. I don't mess with the CIA. Okay, so this is interesting how the hybridized warfare elements sort of play into American lives. Like the fact that it's, again, this is a warfare that is affecting like civilians in a real way that I think people don't always acknowledge or understand. I even wonder if there's things that we'll find out in 5 or 10 years, like, oh, this protest about this, political event, whether it's, free Palestine or support Israel, and the fact that these things are happening in close proximity, I wonder if even that is at the behest of, some type of, Russian intelligence operation, or, like, oh, the drag queens are reading to kids at some random library in Minnesota, and that is front page news. And again, people can have the opinions about these culture war things, but I really wonder if these are all done intentionally and sort of promoted and amplified by external military forces.
So with the Palestinian protests, I can tell you that a lot of that is sponsored by Iran. And actually, the FBI is looking into that. There have been some reported on FBI inquiries into organizations that were, effectively founded with Iranian money, and a lot of them are foreign nationals who have not, registered as agents of foreign governments, and the FBI is looking into some of those things. A lot of and they know where to create the movement, just like the old communists used to. Is they bring these to the students, and they use the students and turn them out in mass. With the protests at Columbia and a few of the others, one of the claims that was made repeatedly in the press that, yeah, some of these are students at the university, but a lot of these people are full-time professional protesters. That's an interesting conversation in and of itself, because, some of that is, organized professional protesters that are being funded with, American 501c3 money. Some of that is foreign money. Some of that is, Iranian money. And they understand how U.S. policy is made in a very real way, and they understand that U.S. politicians have their ear to the ground, and they're observing things like that, and they don't want to cross the street without looking for traffic. So it's a little bit of yes and.
Yeah. At this point, I just don't trust anything.
No, and you shouldn't.
Maybe this is like the end, like this is just like late stage hybrid warfare where I'm just completely disillusioned by all things. If something comes across my news feed or my Instagram or whatever, and it's like, this is the story that everyone needs to be looking at. Immediately I'm like, okay, what type of dissent is this going to sow into the nation? What kind of division will this cause? Secondly, what is the cover up for some type of bigger event that's happening that's, this is trying to take the place of? Immediately, I'm just like, I don't.
Yeah.
Like all the culture war shit, I'm like, I just don't think it matters. Like in the grand scheme of understanding, like how other nations are trying to usurp America as, global number one. I don't see any of these other things as really being that consequential. Am I being reductive?
So, Gosh, do I have a good answer for that?
Again, not to say, I'll put a caveat, not to say that like any, social movement or political event happening within the United States is unimportant. You know what I mean? Like if you are a Palestinian American living in America and you are wanting to go protest, on behalf of your people in Palestine, I'm like, yeah, I understand that is a very legitimate reason to want to go, exercise your right and, for free speech. That makes complete sense. True. But like we've kind of pointed out, there are some people that are being utilized by foreign forces to go do something that they don't necessarily understand the implications of or why they're doing it. And again, I don't want to lump everything in as like a psyop, but there are certain people that are being utilized in greater psyops that maybe, have good seeds and good elements a part of them, across the spectrum. But I don't know. I get skeptical when I see anything that seems like a real big, like, cultural sort of linchpin.
I think where I am on it is I want all foreign agents to be registered. I think that's, in a democracy, that absolutely has to be the case. Democracy works, our democracy works for our people. It doesn't work for, we're not here to represent the Chinese popular opinion in Congress.
And how does that work? What does that mean? Foreign
agents.
Foreign agents.
So if you're representing the interests of a foreign government, and we have foreign lobbyists in the United States. So, if you're, you have foreign lobbyists that are, arguing for certain nuances in U.S. energy policy on behalf of Saudi Arabia, or maybe they're arguing for certain, military export policies on behalf of Israel, right?
And they might be involved in like a consulate or an embassy within the U.S.
Some of them are working out of an embassy. Some of them are nominally working as a, private capacity as an activist, something like that. And I think we got to do a much better job of requiring all those people to register as foreign agents, number one. It probably is a little too easy for people who are working for foreign interests to get U.S. citizenship, or at least U.S. legal status. that's a hard policy to get right, and I don't know that I have an easy answer. And that's definitely a real issue, right? And maybe I'll leave that to better minds to figure out. But the Greeks had an idea of a polis, of a city state, right, where it just belongs to the people of that polis, and they have like these little obelisks that are actually set, a certain number of miles outside of the city that actually show you where the city-state begins. And the idea is that the laws of the city-state apply within those obelisks for the people within those obelisks, and anything else outside of that is not their purview or their domain. And that's important for making sure that policy actually serves the people that have to live under it.
It's extremely localized.
Yeah. And that there's a famous political saying is all politics are local. And that's where that comes from essentially. And, if you, there's a really good classicist historian, Victor Davis Hanson, who talks a lot about these nuances of the Greek city-states. They actually had remarkably sophisticated governments. And for democracy to work, you need a relatively educated population, number one. But the Greeks actually invent a term called mesoi, which is literally middle class. It's like the middle people. And the mesoi come about, especially in ancient Athens, because they build the fleet of Athenian triremes, the Athenian navy, which allows Athens to build an empire. And they have this silver mine outside of Athens that they discover and they're exploiting, and they're using this. It's basically, it's like an expansionist monetary policy. So it's a high times at the golden age of Athens, in the 4th century or the 5th century under Pericles, where, they're building this fleet. And if you are a young man in Athens and you need work and you need to get good pay for work, you can simply grab a rowing seat on the trireme, and you can, go out on the trireme for a few days and come back, and they pay you when you get off the boat. And then you've got cash in your pocket to go do whatever, and you can come back. It's almost like Uber.
Right.
And like any guy that gets off the plane in the United States can immediately drive for Uber or Lyft.
Right. You could do like DoorDash.
Yeah.
And like there's even, companies even in New York where like you don't need to have a bike. You don't need to really have a phone.
Mm-hmm.
Like they'll kind of supply you everything on sort of like a lease basis. So you could just show up and start making money.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a little universal basic employment.
Very little training is required, and all these things need to be done. Right.
Yeah.
And
if I moved here, that's probably what I would do first job. And be like, yeah, get me on a bike, I'll deliver food, make a couple $100 and keep it moving.
And that injection of capital into the working class creates the Athenian middle class, which defines Athenian democracy. And that works very well until that paradigm starts to break, until the paradigm starts to break down in the middle class. But what we conceptualize in terms of, let's say, individual freedoms and liberty, all of the countries that really develop what we would consider individual rights are countries that developed a robust middle class, and that robust middle class is demanding individual rights to protect them from an aristocracy that largely means to rule over them. And if Athens was no different, they do eventually overthrow an Athenian democracy, and they set up an Athenian aristocracy, and they set up a very radical democracy. It's also a lesson of how radical democracy can destroy itself, and that happens during the Peloponnesian War, which is a fascinating discussion in and of itself. But one of the other principal places where a middle class creates itself is in England, under the yeoman class. And you like the Robin Hood stories are about Robin Hood, the yeoman bowman who uses a yew bow, right? Mm-hmm. And he's rewritten in the later stories as a nobleman, but in the originals he was a yeoman. And it's the yeoman class develops in the United Kingdom because unlike France, the king doesn't have to maintain a large standing army to patrol the land borders England is, the Britain is an island, and so the only threat is to the north from the Scots. And for a large portion of their history, that was the case. And so you can, you don't need this large standing army, and it develops an entirely different standard of civil liberties. And it eventually results in the what they called the familiar councils, which are kind of the prototype parliament before the 1225 Magna Carta is signed. We're getting way in the weeds here.
I'm tracking you. How does this apply to the middle class in America today?
Well, it's a fascinating, both Greek and England are fascinating case studies, right? Because what you see happening in the United States today, and this actually goes back to the earlier practices of hybrid warfare with the Soviet Union. And God, I've got to get into the tactical elements of it, right? We're talking about operations still, because the tactical stuff is, it's juicy and interesting and kind of sexy. But with I'm going to come back to the American middle class, I promise. But I gotta lay some groundwork. We finally conquered the Germans during World War II. The Soviets did about 80% of the fighting on the ground. And they're the first to occupy Berlin. We meet them. We partition Germany up, and one of the very first problems we have to contend with are the death camps all over the place. And so we're trying to figure out how to try these German officers, not just in the SS, but in the political class and in the Wehrmacht for effectively crimes against humanity. And the Germans are kind of indignant at the idea, and they try to insist many times that this is simply the justice of the victors. You're trying us and executing us because you won. And they're trying to deny the Allies any real moral superiority on those grounds. And one of the arguments that is partially conceived by Churchill over them is that, no, you've broken some sort of a universal law, a universal law of humanity, and universalism, universal rights, human rights. This concept kind of goes back to the French Revolution, which again is why I'm studying it for the next book. The French Revolution, the intellectuals of the French Revolution, they're also kind of, let's say, history's first atheists. They try to reinvent their culture entirely, and they write the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. This is endorsed by Lafayette, our famous Lafayette. And they try to universalize everything. So they create a new system of measurement based on the density of water that's base 10, and everything's going to be 10. So we're going to have 10 months in the calendar, and we're going to have 10 provinces in France, and all of the roads are going to lead to Paris, and we need to make sure that the roads are equidistant.
This is an element of the intellectual movement of the revolution?
Yeah, it's rationalism. They want it's from Descartes. They want everything to be rational, and so they want to build a perfect, rational society. And immediately where that starts to lead to is, well, we have to get rid of old mysticism. And so first they nationalize the French branch of the Catholic Church, and then they start engaging in mass executions of priests. So all the people that are getting walked to the guillotine aren't just aristocrats; they're nuns, and it gets really nasty. And these are the first enlightened, atheists that are doing this too. Anyway, Churchill is trying to come up with and the others, not just Churchill, but, Eleanor Roosevelt and, the great minds that eventually come up with the United Nations. They're trying to come up with some sort of a rationale to judge the Nazis under and what becomes the Nuremberg trials. And they come up with this idea of universal rights. When the UN is chartered, one of the very first things that the Eastern Bloc countries do is they start adding a lot of the implementation language to, the UN creates its Charter of Human Rights, which is loosely based on the French Declaration of the Rights of Man. And one of the very first things that the Eastern Bloc countries all start doing is in the implementation language of those high level listed rights, is they start transforming a lot of those rights. These in our Constitution we have the Bill of Rights, right? So the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, and these are all prohibitions against the state. They're prohibitions, that deny certain authorities and privileges to the state to protect the individual from the overreaching power of the state. And the Soviet bloc, the Eastern Bloc, what they do in the United Nations, and in the way that they conceptualize and they define human rights, when they write some of the subordinate language below the statute, the way they try to reinterpret the Western beliefs and rights is by saying that we need to protect intersectional groups. We need to protect, minority ethnicities and select groups that have been oppressed and marginalized from the majority. And so we need an overarching state with the power to protect all of these different factions and groups within a culture from one another. And it's a completely reinterpretation of rights. One of the very first things that the Soviets try to implement into the language is that is a prohibition against the freedom of speech, and it's that something can't be. The governments can't be fascist. And the moment a government becomes fascist, they become illegitimate, and essentially the Soviet bloc says they have the right to overthrow that government. Well, what does fascist mean? It's not in the language, and it turns out that fascist means literally anything that the government in Moscow doesn't like and it wants to get rid of.
Right.
And so, we can all agree that we don't want to live under a fascist regime, but
there's really no clear definition of fascism,
right? And who's going to define what fascism is? And it's exactly the person you would not want to define fascism.
The people with the power.
Yeah. And it's kind of like hate speech laws now, right? And I don't want to go too deep into, a culture war issue, right? But the problem is not that there's no such thing as hate speech. The problem is not that people aren't cruel to each other. And, honest to God, if you've never had a conversation with somebody about something that is real, like if you ever had a fight with, your wife, or if you've ever tried to convince your father to stop drinking, you've probably uttered some hate speech.
Yeah.
Right? And literally everybody on earth has said something that was hurtful, might have been truthful, but you've probably said something that was really hurtful.
Yeah, I got some hate speeches under my...
Yeah.
I hit one today probably.
Right.
Just even driving over here, you know what I mean?
And
my hate speech cut me off. I had to let him know, you know what I mean? I got pissed off.
There you go.
That's a choose your own adventure. That can be whoever you want. You can pick whoever in that car.
I grew up in Texas, and I don't speak Spanish, but I understand Mexican fairly well. And it's the kind of Mexican that you shout at somebody when they cut you off in traffic.
Yeah. The guy that cut me off was white, by the way. Just so you know. Yeah, I would never say it to a minority. Are you crazy? No. He's a dumb white guy.
Yeah. Entitled,
privileged. Ugh, the worst.
So, one of my buddies, he grew up in Guatemala, and it was just like, hey man, like, what does this mean? And he's like, oh, you don't want to know.
What's up, guys? We're gonna take a break really quick, because if you're anything like me, you're probably running late all the time. I am. I'm always leaving right when I'm supposed to be somewhere, and I never have time to sit down and grab a nutritious meal. And that's why I want to talk to you about this little product right here called Huel. Huel is absolutely amazing. It's got everything you need, all the essential vitamins and minerals, all the nutrients, all the protein you need in a regular meal, packaged in this beautiful, convenient little bottle. That's right. No more of the days of you running out the door being like, oh, I'll just grab some fast food or something. Oh, I'll have the leftover cheeseburger in the fridge. No. With Huel, it's healthy, nutritious, everything you need to power through the day, served in this little bottle right here. I mean, this has got 35 grams of protein, 7 grams of fiber, 27 vitamins and minerals. Everything's right on the back, and this will help you get through the day. It'll help you perform better, not only in the workplace, but also in the gym. I mean, at this point, I think they've sold over 400 million meals. I mean, is it 400 million? I mean, that's amazing. 400 million meals. So why not you? Take control of your health, be a little bit more time efficient, and get all the essentials that you need in every little bottle. If you're interested, go to Huel.com, use the promo code CAMP. That's Huel, Huel.com. Use the promo code CAMP and get 15% off your first order. Check it out right now. Get control of your health, get control of your life, and stop being so late. Let's just fix that also. Be on time, all right? Set an alarm. Let's get back to the show.
If you've never had a serious conversation about anything, then you might be free from having never uttered hate speech. But the people that define that are exactly the people that you don't want defining those things.
Now, again, this is the Russian interpretation of their own laws.
This is the Eastern Bloc worked very hard in the United Nations to write the implementation language for a lot of the high-level rights that were put into the UN Charter.
Within the UN?
Yeah.
Oh.
And so there's a permanent nesting for a lot of these ideas. And so when you start to, when you start to look at these ideas outlive the Soviet Union and they outlive Mao. They outlive Pol Pot. And they're all ideas that argue for an expansive state that has the responsibility of controlling the public.
And this is done intentionally by the intelligentsia of the eastern state, of the Soviets.
Yes, the Soviets.
At the end of World War II, they say, hey, we are going to implement language that basically, as the governing bodies, we will control, and we have an obligation to protect the minority groups of, the intersectional groups of any specific population. With the intention, do you believe it was a malignant intention that they were saying, oh, we can use this as a tool for control? Because it sounds good on its face. You know what I mean?
They sound very cuddly. All of these ideas sound very cuddly at face value until you actually look at how they're being implemented. And you can look at you can look at how it is that the UN, has intervened in Marxist conflicts in, let's say, Africa, to really understand what these words on paper actually create and result. But bringing this back to the American middle class is a very different understanding. The British middle class is a very different understanding of what rights are. And it creates a fundamental conflict and clash with, a ruling class, especially a university educated ruling class that doesn't understand rights in exactly the same language. That is definitely something that is worth exploring, and I'd love to hear somebody, write a deep book about it. Can we get into the tactical elements of hybrid warfare?
Let's do it.
So the GRU is the Russian Military Intelligence Service. It's one of three. So there used to be the GRU and the KGB. The GRU is the oldest, in the Soviet Union. I think its first head was actually Trotsky. And the KGB was founded after World War II. And it's like they've gone through a certain number of secret police organizations, and the KGB was created. When the Soviet Union collapses in 1991 and the KGB collapses with it, the first chief director to the KGB becomes the SVR, the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service. And the first chief director was the one who was doing all the foreign operations. Second chief director of the KGB becomes the FSB, which is the largest and most powerful of the Russian intel services, and it takes the lion's share of the KGB personnel and infrastructure with it. And it, that's their new secret police in a lot of ways, and it's kind of it's like a cross between. It's like if the FBI. It's like if the CIA was inward looking and the FBI had 4 or 5 times the budget that they have.
Wow.
It's in the SVR is the smallest intel service in Russia. It's very boutique. They're very selective about who they bring on, and they're known for being kind of chic and sophisticated in comparison.
So it's FSB, GRU, KGB.
Well, the KGB is gone, so it's FSB and SVR come from the KGB. The GRU is independent from the KGB throughout all of Russia's history. And then the GRU is the only one that survives the Soviet collapse and remains in relatively its same current form.
So KGB dissolved in the 90s?
Yeah, it dissolved it's dissolved when the Soviet Union collapsed in 91.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, so it's gone. And what we're dealing with now is, two pieces of the remnants of it, and then the GRU, which was always independent. And the GRU they run maybe 6 times more operatives abroad than the SVR. But they're supposed to be, they also own all of Russia's Spetsnaz brigades. So this is interesting because the Spetsnaz brigades belong to Russia's military districts. So each military district, Western military district, Southern, Central, Eastern, they have a Spetsnaz brigade that basically serves as an in-house strategic reconnaissance asset. These Spetsnaz brigades are supposed to do deep reconnaissance way ahead of ground forces, maybe, do some targeted assassinations, see if they can disrupt enemy command and control and feed information back as the ground forces advance in a major war. But even though they belong to the districts, they're operationally controlled by the GRU, and the GRU centralizes all military intelligence under its house. Separately from the Spetsnaz brigades, GRU has what they call agentury, which is, just a Russian word for agent, and those are the trained intelligence operatives of the GRU. And it's interesting because a lot of those guys are former Spetsnaz men, which gives this agency kind of it's not just a military feel. It's kind of like, here's the objective, and this is the result that we want to achieve. And so this is the amount of leverage that we need. And, this is the tool we're going to use. This is the amount of leverage and force that we have to apply in order to achieve that result. And it's kind of disconnected from the sensitivities of international relations, let's say. And so remember the assassination attempt on Sergei Skripal? That was the GRU.
Got it.
And they answer to the Russian general staff. They actually answer to the chief of the Russian general staff. And so in order to assuming military bureaucracy is a zero-sum game, in order to get noticed by the Kremlin, they kind of had to do these little, I'm over here still games. And I think that's kind of what that was. That was kind of a very ham-fisted, stupid thing to do. And apparently no one in the Kremlin asked for it. And so they were trying to get noticed. And they created not only an international incident, but like using nerve agent on a foreign soil of another country and killing some of their citizens with it
is crazy.
Crazy.
They got noticed.
They got noticed, and 150 career Russian diplomats and intelligence officers were ejected from Europe, and another 50 from the United States because of that.
Wow.
So the collective intelligence losses to Moscow were so appalling that the head of the GRU, Igor Korobov, was basically called into the Kremlin that summer for an intense dressing down. And apparently he collapsed in his home from stress about a month later. We'll never know what that stress was from. It might have been a bullet behind the ear, or maybe he accidentally tied himself to a chair and then accidentally fell in a lake.
I think he was anxious.
You think he was anxious?
I think he was probably drinking too much coffee, and I think he got a little anxious, and I think his heart gave out.
That's my. I hate it when that happens.
That's my theory. All right. I don't want to get killed, Curtis. All right. I'm on the side of propaganda. Okay. I bet you the Russians are telling the truth. I think he was stressed out.
They never lie. So these are the guys that in a good hybrid war are going to be very active. There's a couple of other specialist units, right? So the VDV are the Russian airborne forces, airborne infantry, and they're actually a separate military service. So you've got Russian ground forces, Russian Navy, the aerospace forces, and then the VDV. And those guys are they're ground forces, but they're all airborne or air mobile, and they are basically like a quick reaction force for the Russian president. So he can, and they're considered the elite trigger pullers of the Russian system. And they have one Spetsnaz brigade inside them as well, called the 45th. Then you've got a couple of boutique special missions units. The Ministry of Defense has one that's crafted loosely off of Western special missions units like the SAS or, some of the elite units in the U.S. arsenal. They actually call that the KSSO, which literally just means Special Operations Forces Command. Very, very original. And then they've got, and that is... it's an interesting unit and how they run it and how they're doing a very good job of recruiting people and building teams within that unit. And then the FSB has a couple of special missions units inside of it. So the two that are the most prominent are Alpha and Vimpel, which are both Cold War holdovers. They used to work for the KGB. So Alpha had the job of protecting Soviet political leadership, and it was used a lot internally within the Soviet Union to conduct counterintelligence operations. Vimpel was actually, it's a sword rather than a shield, and it's designed to decapitate foreign governments. And so the Vimpel operatives in the old KGB days could speak like 3 or 4 foreign languages. And all of those guys were recruited from the KGB's illegals program. So, the illegals program they would place these, they would find like a child that's died in childbirth or something like that, but there's a birth certificate out there. And, this child would be in like Canada, let's say. And then they would build a paper trail around this birth certificate as though the child had grown up and hand this identity off to one of their operatives. And like they might even have like a husband and a wife, they'll recruit 2 agents to be like, hey, look, like we think you'd work together in the field. You guys want to get married here in Russia. And then you're gonna go to the West, lead separate lives. And then you're going to meet by chance in university and you'll get married and you'll have people attend your wedding and everyone will think that you're a normal Western couple.
Jack Barksy did this. Are you familiar with him?
I'm not familiar with the name.
He's a former KGB agent that, I guess, defected in a way. He came on the show and he spoke about his time basically in the KGB, came to America in the 70s and lived here and kind of worked his way up through corporate America and was like communicating with, with the Soviets through a satellite base in Cuba. Wow. Crazy life. Ended up falling in love, had a child, stayed here. They tried to sort of get him out. Insane story. I digress. But I believe when he came to America, he came through Mexico. I think he went from, I believe it was East Germany to Canada to Mexico to Chicago. And he basically was able to get fake documents through the government, through obviously the Soviet government, but furthermore used this illegals program where his name, Jack Barksy, came from a child who had died and was able to use his birth certificate and basically usurp his identity. So he's an actual case of someone on the record that says, this is exactly what I did in order to get his name, Jack Barksy. That's not his real name.
Dude, I don't know if you ever have me back on the show, I wonder if we could do like a 3-way, you and me and Jack Barksy and talk. That would be a fun conversation.
Bro, you would love to talk to him. He was a really, really interesting guy, really, really sharp. I mean, this guy was so smart. Obviously, he was a, intelligence asset for the Russians. They found him through university because he was like top of his class at university when he was in East Germany. And, dude, he came to America, went to Baruch College in New York City, became the valedictorian again of his college here, spoke at Madison Square Garden for the valedictorian address. A known KGB spy was speaking at like the height of the Cold War. I think this is like, I don't even know. This is probably like mid-70s.
They don't recruit stupid people, man.
But like, I think for me at least, I kind of, and Jack is an older guy now and still incredibly sharp, like just dialed in and extremely good at pattern recognition, a really good social navigator. And ended up falling in love with a Guyanese American woman and had a baby and stayed here ever since.
I'm going to go find him on YouTube now and see what
I'll send you the episode. It's really, really, really cool.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Pretty crazy. Yeah. I mean, the whole story, because it's a spy story, but if you really listen to it, it's really a love story. It's unbelievable. But anyway, so this is exactly to your point. They used his name is a name from, a child that something happened to him and basically usurped it.
So Imagine a covert special missions unit where these guys are given the absolute pinnacle of military training in special operations, but only the Jack Borskys are recruited for that unit, and it's Jack Borsky and people like him.
Yeah.
And there's only about, in the modern iteration of VIPL, I think there's about 300 guys in the whole thing.
Yeah, I think he said even at the time when he was deployed in the U.S., they had like no real known agents. They had a consulate and an embassy, and there was like diplomats, but obviously the diplomats are all spies, and so he had no connection with them because all the diplomats were being tracked by FBI and American agents, and so basically he was like, I think there was like 8 or 10 other spies at the time during the entire duration of his program, from like 60s, 70s all the way up until. I think it was probably more like 70s, 80s. But that the entire time, there's only like 10 other spies that he was disclosed were like in the United States operating. So it was extremely selective, extremely small at that time. And I'm sure it's grown now, but it's a really, really elite level, intelligence asset.
It's, I'll tell you what, it's a little shocking. Some of the lengths the Soviets were willing to go to in certain instances like that. And,
still going on today, though.
It's still going on today. Well, and I talk about in the book in 2010, the FBI had a mass roundup. They got like 10 deep cover operatives that were operating in the United States, under false names and stuff. In this exchange that just happened, so with the war going on in Ukraine right now, the Europeans are taking counterintelligence very seriously, and so they're monitoring the Russians. The Russians have had a ton of spies expelled from Europe in the last few years, and so they've had to do a lot of the more mundane reporting using some of their crown jewel intelligence assets. These are deep cover agents that are supposed to be getting into the boardrooms of Europe. And they're doing, atmospherics reporting, and, it's like delivering newspapers with a Ferrari. Like, you can do it, but it's just like, why would you? Like, it's why put the, the wear and tear on the transmission? And that's what they're doing with some of these guys. And, so more of their deep cover operatives are getting caught. And, in this recent exchange, what I was telling you when we were walking over to the studio, we got a bunch of journalists and like Alexei Navalny, political dissidents from the Russians, and what the Russians got was a bunch of deep cover intelligence operatives that had been, been hiding out in Europe and the United States and other places
at an exchange rate of 2 to 1, right?
Yeah, I think I want to say it was 16, and we got 16, and they got 8.
But again, this is not a parody. I think it's important to like drive this point home that it's 16, American journalists and political dissidents, so to speak, for 8 extremely specialized, extremely competent intelligence assets that now are back released free to walk around Moscow and potentially get redeployed back around the world.
That's the one piece of good news, is that they'll probably never get redeployed. I think a lot of them will be sent to the training pipeline, and they'll become trainers and things like that.
Makes sense.
If you redeploy them, we already know who they are. We've already got their fingerprints. We already know to watch them.
Yeah, the biometrics are probably tagged. Yeah,
and so there's not a lot they can do without being a greater liability than an asset. The other thing is they can never become decision makers in, the SVR or the GRU or the FSB, right? Like, they can't move up the hierarchy anymore. They can't work as, mid-level bureaucrats in those agencies because 1 or 2 of them might have flipped. And the Russians can never fully trust those people again.
Wow.
Because they, who's to say if they did or didn't, but, they can never actually, those guys are burned now. And so the ones that they really trust might get to, train the next generation in some sense.
But you're never going to climb up the ladder.
Yeah, they're never going to climb the ladder.
Wow, because some of these guys might have been in American, captivity for 8 years, 10 years, who's to say what happens in that timeline? Maybe they get some funding, maybe they met an American woman, who knows? but there is some level of compromise that the Russians will never be fully, content with.
Mm-hmm.
That is really, really interesting. Wow.
So I know Anna Chapman. You've heard of her?
Mm.
Oh, look her up on your phone.
She's cool.
Yeah, she's a model now in Russia.
How sick.
She was one of the ones captured in 2010 that the FBI exchanged to Russia. And, she was trying to climb political circles in the United States to get into the Hillary Clinton campaign. Well, Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. And, so she was living in New York and she was hitting like all the cosmopolitan New York parties and stuff like that. And, she is the quintessential Russian honeypot. She looks like Black Widow from the Marvel comics.
No,
like,
she's a cutie.
Yeah, she's pretty red hair and stuff. And when she got back to Russia, she was not a particularly gifted agent. She was a good social ladder climber, but as a covert intelligence operative, she was a nobody. But what she does now in Russia is like modeling and interviews. Like she's a celebrity over there.
Oh wow!
And
and she lives in Russia now.
Yeah, she just and she can't leave Russia. She'd get arrested, right? But
she couldn't defect to the U.S.
No,
like she couldn't cooperate and hand over secrets.
No, she probably didn't. I would be astonished if she had anything of value.
Wow.
But yeah, she she does these photo shoots, and they'll give her like a pistol and some sort of sexy, Black Widow adjacent outfit, and she'll do these little speeches, and she meets with kids in high school. Yep, that's a great example right there.
I never heard of this. Wow.
But yeah, she'll go talk to a bunch of high school boys and girls, and she'll tell them about the glamorous life of working as a spy. And
whoa, that's wild.
So,
do you think she got anything? I mean, she was just like operating within social circles. Did she ever get up into the political ranks?
No, she was trying to.
Do you know how she got compromised?
Oh, man, I'm scratching old brain cells.
Like, for example, with Barksy, the way he got compromised is a different agent got compromised in London. And then that guy went and cooperated with the federal authorities in England. And then basically was like, hey, look out for this guy, Barksy in New York. It's an assumed name.
I can't remember the guy's name, but I think it was a Russian turncoat. It was somebody that got flipped, and they dimed out these 10 deep cover operatives in the United States. I think that's what it was. There's a book about it. It's called Russians Among Us.
Crazy.
And you can dive into that book, and it'll tell you all about it.
Wow.
But so anyway, all of these different elements are employed tactically in hybrid warfare. So if the Russians determine, when they're deploying the targeted propaganda and the economics, coercion, the financial sanctions, the debt diplomacy, and they determine that they can't get the outcome that they want through those means, they might try something a little bit more direct. So you'll say in the Crimean annexation, Ukraine is destabilized as a government because of the Euromaidan protests. Viktor Yanukovych has now fled the country. Vladimir Putin went into a overnight planning session with his principal military advisors and intelligence advisors, and they came up with a plan for annexing Crimea, because Crimea has the Sevastopol naval base, and it's how Russia projects power into the Black Sea, and from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean and the Indian Oceans. Losing that port would be catastrophic. And so they go into a deep planning on how they're going to take and annex Crimea.
Isn't that the only Russian port that doesn't freeze over?
Mm-hmm. Well, Vladivostok in the east, but I mean, that's, how many thousands of miles away.
Fair. But this one in Crimea is strategic because it's operational all year.
Yep.
Got it.
And they've got ports in the Baltics, but I mean, these are deep water ports are a rare commodity for Russia.
Right.
So anyway, they immediately come up with a limited list of key objectives that have to be seized immediately. And they employ local militias. They start putting intelligence operatives into Ukraine to keep the government paralyzed. They threaten public officials. They bribe police chiefs to keep their police officers from interfering in riots. They turn out GRU operatives or FSB operatives to create riots and public displays of displeasure. And then they use the Night Wolves biker gang, of which Putin is a member.
What?
Yeah, the Night Wolves biker gang.
Putin is a member of a biker gang?
Yeah. You see, like when he goes out and meets with them, he'll stand there in a leather jacket and some sunglasses. It's really funny.
I've never seen this.
There's some of the hardest, like, you picture what hard-looking bikers look like, and then picture them with like Russian prison tattoos.
Wow.
It's a funny bunch of guys.
And this is like 2014, 2015 time? What year is
2014. This is February of 2014, and then on into March, the Crimean annexation, and it's done by April.
Wow.
So anyway, the Spetsnaz units on the ground, they're given a series of objectives that they have to seize. They use all of these popular, protests that have been generated to kind of paralyze the institutions around them so that they have enough chaos to seize gains in those objectives rapidly. And then once these Spetsnaz units hit those, those road intersections, or with the Crimean Peninsula, there's two isthmuses where, they seize those bridges and nobody can get in or out. Like they've seized the island or, the peninsula. Key railroads, airstrips, and they seize those things rapidly. They cordon off and surround Ukrainian garrisons immediately. And then once those Spetsnaz detachments have made those gains, then they surge in either the Russian naval infantry, it's their version of the Marines, or they surge in the airborne troops, which are larger and have more firepower, and those larger conventional forces seize those gains made. And once those larger conventional forces are in place, the idea that you could muster enough firepower to dislodge them is unlikely, number one. But number two, if you did, you'd start a major war. And the Ukrainians were either too disorganized, or lacked the political will, or lacked the kinetic firepower in all those situations to confront Russian forces in a real way. And so at the tactical level, that's how they make the gains. You create chaos that allows you to grab some sort of a hand position, and then you surge forces in to create a foothold, and then you expand that foothold. And that's, at the tactical level, how hybrid warfare works.
Wow.
So this is where so they did this in Georgia, and the three case studies I give in the book are the Russo-Georgian War in 2008, the Crimean annexation in February and March of 2014, and then the war in Donbas, which was the Russians had sponsored an insurgency in eastern Ukraine, the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine, from April of 2014 on through the winter of 2014 into 2015. And then they create like a new status quo with the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics acting as buffer states.
Wow. And could you just reiterate again, like sort of those pieces? You say there's an operational element, create the foothold, expand the foothold.
Yes. So create chaos that allows you to, that gives you the space, the room to maneuver and operate, and then establish a foothold with elite forces that can rapidly seize limited objectives, and then surge large conventional forces in to secure those footholds and entrench your gains.
Okay. That's a really clear, I like that as like an infrastructure to understand how this works, because I think that's pretty clear. And I wonder if we can kind of go through some examples in Georgia and Donbass. Sure. So you have chaos that's created. This is sort of like the operational side. And this is why it's hybridized, obviously, because you have chaos that is coming in, which again is not tactical military. And then you have an elite force that goes and creates, you just need an inch. They can just get a foothold, and then bring in reinforcements that then will expand the foothold. So it's kind of those three steps. Is that fair? Is that too reductive?
Yeah, I think that's good.
Okay. So can you take me through, obviously we discussed kind of how that happened in 2014, but in Georgia, for example, in 2008, how does that similar hybrid warfare happen?
So Georgia is a really good success story of hybrid warfare. I would argue that if hybrid warfare had a Woodstock, the Crimean annexation would be it.
Okay.
Um, but uh, but Georgia is another good success story because the Russians got the Georgians to engage on their terms. Um, this was all centered around South Ossetia, which was the Russian controlled autonomous, one of two Russian controlled autonomous enclaves in Georgia. There was a third one. There's a second one called Abkhazia that's on the coast of the Black Sea. South Ossetia is located in the center of the country, but it's on the northern border with the northern Caucasus mountain range. And on the other side of the mountain range is Russia proper, of which a province is North Ossetia. And then there's a third one called Ajara. So in 2003, 2004, there was a new Georgian president, a populist that was elected, and he brought in a new government that was very much, Georgia nationalist, right? And he was trying to, the Russians want to be able to control that regime in Tbilisi. Because they very much value the Caucasus range. That's the Caucasus region. That's North Ossetia, Dagestan, Chechnya. This is a place that gives the Russians a lot of heartburn. And it's one of the gateways into Russia. So when Saakashvili comes to power, one of the very first things that he does when he becomes president is he repeats his kind of populist election when he becomes president of Tbilisi in this autonomous republic of Ajara, which is in the south. And he kind of re-annexes Ajara back into Georgia proper. And this Russian de facto governor has to board the plane of the Russian foreign minister and go into political exile. And so, Putin sees that and he realizes, like, holy crap, like,
we're losing Georgia.
Yeah, like this guy we're gonna lose Georgia if we let this guy continue. So he gives Saakashvili a very stern warning not to try that again in any of the other two. And then they start planning in a very serious way about how they're going to deal with Saakashvili.
They being the Russians.
The Russians. And so what Vladimir Putin does, I've got a little thing helping my back here.
Some lumbar support.
Yeah.
Not the most comfortable chairs, but they look cool.
They do look cool. Well, I'm in a campsite, right?
Exactly.
So they start this plan to figure out how they're going to deal with Georgia, and they start slowly surging in assets into South Ossetia and Abkhazia to train these local militias, stand them up, arm them. They even build an academy to train local officers. And then they start doing, exercises on the northern border. And then, once they're at a certain level of competence by 2006 and 2007, they start needling the Georgians.
And why did the Georgians let them bring in, weapons and training?
Well, first, there's not a lot they can do about it, right? Unless you want to go to war with Russia, which, tiny little Georgia would lose. But the second issue is that Saakashvili had a lot on his plate. I mean, he was transforming the entire Georgian government. He's got political adversaries. Many of them are Soviet-era holdovers. He's got to figure out how to expel those people. He's transforming the officer corps of the army. They actually send a brigade to participate in NATO operations in Iraq in 2008. So the first brigade, when this war happens, the first brigade's actually at war in Iraq. And so they're observing. They know the Russians are starting to become more active, and soon the Russians start to needle them. Suddenly, there are mortar rounds that are accidentally going over the border into Georgia. Suddenly, there are artillery bombardments that are happening on Georgian terrain. Suddenly, fighter planes start violating Georgian airspace. And the Russians, as these militias become more and more active, start to needle the Georgians more and more and more. And then, the Russians are actually, they start conducting field exercises, large-scale field exercises on the northern side of the border. And they kind of set the conditions for the war so that when Saakashvili is finally forced to respond by invading South Ossetia to deal with all these provocations, that they can claim, first off, the Georgians are invading, and we're defending an ethnic Russian enclave. And then they immediately had a plan in place to surge conventional Russian ground forces into country. And it's the same strategy. It's this rapid surge of elite forces to seize limited objectives. And then entrench those gains.
Wow.
And it was remarkably effective. The whole conflict was only, 10 days? Not even that. Like the real ground fighting was 5 days, but the whole thing was wrapped up with a nice neat little bow by 10 days.
And it was over before it started. I mean, the Russians knew, and again, this is, I think, why it's so important and shouldn't be underestimated, sort of like the cultural elements of placing ethnic Russians, Russian-speaking people into other nations, is that you have this little like border area where, again, these borders are man-made. There's no like direct mountain range directly in that area. So it's a, man-made border that says, hey, the people in this northern region, they speak Russian, they're autonomous, they love Russia, they love Putin. These are ethnic Russians and we need to protect them. And they create enough provocation where now when the Georgians go in, because they have to, they look like the agitators, they look like the aggressors. And then Russia can wrap it up in, a couple days. It's just really, really cunning strategic effort on their part. When you frame it that way, it's all of a sudden, a
lot of things fall into place, right?
What are you going to do? And then you can see how that's sort of replicated in Crimea. And in some ways, I'm curious, like, does this kind of hybrid warfare track to the invasion of Ukraine that we saw just a couple of years ago?
It does, but that's where this gets real fun. So let me, there's a couple of things to point out, maybe in the intermediate space before we get to it. So there was a whole war in Syria, right? The Syrian civil war, and the Russians. The way I talk about in the book is that it was not a hybrid war, but it was a hybrid-ish war. The Russians aren't denying their involvement, and they're not really using targeted propaganda in any real way because, it's
a proxy war ultimately.
Yeah, it was a proxy war, and they were operating through Syrian ground forces, and they were using Spetsnaz detachments to do basically terminal guidance and deep reconnaissance against isolated enclaves of the Syrian Democratic Forces and then ISIS. ISIS was a secondary objective. They talked a lot about that in Western facing media to try to create some legitimacy for their combat operations in Syria. But the reality is that Assad was an ally. They wanted to preserve his regime. They wanted to preserve the Russian naval base at Tartus. And then, they certainly did not want the United States to, be successful in supporting the Syrian Democratic Forces. And they wanted to cast Russia as a credible alternative to American strategic power in the Middle East. And in that facet, they were very effective. They really did embarrass, the United States in some of those engagements. Because, they as long as you don't care about civilian casualties, you can make very strong military gains. And Surovikin, who we'll talk about in a little bit later, was he was the ground force commander in Syria. He was one of Russia's most ruthless generals. They call him General Armageddon. And
sick name.
Yeah, he was the one that suggested that bombing the civilian population directly would create strategic gains in Syria.
Oh,
and his observation was correct. He's a ruthless son of a bitch, but he's empirical. And what he put his finger on that's true is that refugees don't fight back. They will flow northward into Turkey, and ultimately the Turks will let them pass through into Europe, and it becomes a cultural issue for the Europeans to deal with. So there's no downside here.
And that, as we've seen, has sort of played out.
Yeah, that's exactly what's happened.
Wow.
In fact, that was you could argue that was a core component of Brexit.
Wow.
The Germany, Angela Merkel decides for the rest of the European Union that they're going to have a policy of accepting all the refugees that are flowing in from the Middle East and Africa. The middle class in the United Kingdom looks at that and says, well, like, look, we're having a hard time making ends meet as it is. Like our government works for us, not for, the people of Syria. And when the Brexit referendum comes up, it shocks everyone that they voted for Brexit, but they did.
Right. I mean, yeah, only in the past couple of years, I think it was Sweden started checking paperwork from people coming in from Denmark, I think, or something to that effect, which effectively, if every country's checking each other's papers, specifically in Europe, it's like, well, what is the point of having an EU? Like, what is the purpose of it if, one, we're taking on, a lot of the financial burden from these other nations? Like if Greece gets an economic ruin, all of a sudden we got to take care of them. That's, feels like some bullshit. And then on top of that, we got to check all the paperwork of people coming into our country. It's like, do we even have a, unified European state, or are we just individual states under this sort of fake, phony umbrella? And so you can see how, do you think that's intentional? Do you think like engaging in this proxy war in Syria was like, because you can look at the downriver effects and kind of draw this conclusion to say like, oh, who does it benefit? Therefore, we can draw intentionality to it.
Yeah.
But have you read, or is there like things that you've looked at where you say like, oh, this was an intentional effort that by probing this proxy war, displacing these people throughout Europe, it's going to create chaos, which again is part one of this hybrid warfare tactic?
Yes, that tactic, that tactic was absolutely deliberate. I mean, they didn't, it's a little bit too complimentary of Russian planning to, assume that they actually knew what the results were going to be.
Right. Yeah. I don't think they could have predicted that Brexit necessarily was going to be a component.
They just know that, oh, this looks valuable. Let's throw a monkey wrench in those gears. And yeah, they're doing that now. They try to dump refugees into Poland through Belarus. They'll route them from like Kazakhstan or from, they've got borders with a bunch of different, Muslim majority countries, and they'll take somebody from a different religion and a different ethnicity that doesn't speak any Polish, probably not any English, and they'll just drop them off in Poland, or they'll drop them off on the border of Finland. Wow. Like, all right, they're your problem. Go.
It's a shame. Everyone's screwed there. You know what I mean? These refugees that are being displaced, right? Like there's a civil war happening in their country. Like they are legitimately without a place to go. Mm-hmm. And then, these European countries that have a social infrastructure and have a, they have a status quo for how they operate is all of a sudden now being disrupted by this influx of this new population that doesn't necessarily assimilate or take some time to assimilate. Mm-hmm. That's going to create chaos.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sucks for everyone, and Russia happens to benefit from this chaos, it seems like.
Yep, and that's where they thrive, is if they can create some chaos, they know how to make gains in chaos. So the Syrian civil war, that was a good maturing experience for the Russian aerospace forces. They start rotating pilots through to get joint operations experience, and they start this iterative development process with their ordnance so that they can create ground attack ordnance that's a little bit more sophisticated, a little bit more precise. They used dumb bombs before the Syrian civil war. By the end of the civil war, they're using smart bombs that can, be pretty precisely dropped onto targets. And the Spetsnaz guys loved it for, the way they say it is they'd been training for that exact mission for 30 years, and they finally got to do the mission that they were training for. And
casualty free. Like they don't lose any Russians in the process, right? Like
you lose a few, but it's trivial compared to.
But you're not fighting a home battle. You know what I mean? Like in terms of like your civilization, your populace, like you get to try out all of these military ops without any real risk to like losing ground, losing influence, or looking like a global bad guy because it's sort of fought on proxy.
And that's a real benefit of hybrid war, which is one of the reasons I call it a hybridish war. How deep do I want to dive here? So let's call the Syrian civil war a very real success because Russia establishes themselves as the dominant power broker in Syria. They set up all these air defense networks. But there's this moment in 2018 where they're trying this hybrid warfare tactic on American forces. There's a U.S. Special Operations Force that's guarding the Deir el-Zor oil platforms, and that unit ends up getting reinforced with some Rangers who gets they get reinforced with like an ODA and Marine quick reaction force. And the Russians, you read about this maybe in the New York Times, 'cause I think the Times reported on it. But the Russians, basically, it's the Wagner mercenaries. They decide that they can take this platform, and so they assemble a tank column, and they start the deconfliction line between Russian and American forces is the Euphrates River, and they've got this massive tank force that starts assembling on the other bank of the Euphrates River. And we're watching this with aerial reconnaissance, and we're just like, well, we know they're Russian. And so Secretary Mattis calls Valery Gerasimov, the chief of the Russian general staff, on a deconfliction line, and he's like, hey, we see what you're doing, knock it off. And Gerasimov's like, no, those aren't Russian forces. They're not. I don't have any control over them. And Mattis says, okay, well, they're all about to die. And the moment they cross, what he didn't tell Gerasimov was that he'd stacked up on like several layers of American air support assets. And so the moment these tanks cross the Euphrates River and all these armored personnel carriers, they get crushed with wave after wave after wave of close air support. And the units on the ground are literally sighting them for the planes and calling in airstrike after airstrike after airstrike on these guys. So they get pounded for a couple hours, and the few survivors crawl out of the wreckage of their vehicles and basically flee back across the river. And in the aftermath, we counted something like 200 Wagner operatives that were dead. And like the idea that they weren't Russian was preposterous. Like, we can hear them talking on open radio channels in Russian. So anyway, what they had been hoping for was that the prospect of actually shooting at real Russian forces would be a political hot button, that it would be a political hot potato that everyone would be, they would be loath to decide to do themselves as an officer on the ground. Like, there are Russian guys that have crossed the Euphrates. We don't know what to do. Somebody tell me if I have permission to engage. And what they were hoping was that decision would climb up the chain of command to a political level where a politician, whether it's the Secretary of Defense or the president, would waffle for a moment on making the decision of what to do here. And they would scramble to call the Russians, and the Russians would say they don't know anything about it. And they would use that moment of indecisiveness to seize the platform and probably overwhelm the U.S. garrison. And Mattis, it's not just him, it's the ground force commander and the theater commander, whoever the U.S. CENTCOM commander was at the time. They had all done a very good job of requesting the delegated authorities from the President of the United States and the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense so that they could make the decisions in real time. Quickly. And that turns out to be the recipe to really defeating the hybrid warfare at the tactical level is you can't give them any ambiguity. The response to hybrid
immediate and
decisive. Hybrid warfare relies on very limited kinetic force to seize relatively unguarded objectives, and then they surge in the real firepower after they've already made gains.
You also, I think, need the firepower to respond decisively, right? Like, Georgia could have responded decisively to, military operations and sort of, military theater and exercises happening on the border, but they don't really have the might in order to like execute a decisive or quick response.
There's truth to that. Yeah. I mean,
so America can combat it.
I mean, yeah, Mattis had to authorize, or let's say the U.S. CENTCOM commander had to authorize, significant theater assets to be made available to the ground force commander in order to create that recipe, right? And that had to be done days beforehand. And so, yeah, there's a lot of truth in what you're saying.
Again, not that I think it makes it moot at all. I mean, I'm just trying to think through like the other times, like the other examples you're giving, like Georgia, Crimea, if they were more decisive, if they were able to work faster, could they have quelled these sort of like chaotic uprisings before they even got a foothold? Maybe. Yeah. I mean, especially if they could get like some like reinforcements or like allies that had like firepower. I'm trying to think in Crimea specifically if that would have worked. Like, I wonder if that little gap where you're talking about the hybridized warfare, like, moment of indecision.
I'm not sure. The Russians had such a massive advantage in Crimea because they've got one of the world's largest naval facilities at Sevastopol, and they've got garrisons that are under Russian control. They're actually leasing base space in Crimea,
right?
And so their access is unparalleled.
Yeah. I don't think there's anything you can do there.
Yeah.
Hey guys, really quick, did you know that on this day in history in 1582, Pope Gregory introduced the Gregorian calendar, which most of the world still uses today? Or that in 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite, into orbit. This event triggered the space race between the USA and the USSR. I learned these facts pretty recently, actually, on the S'more Camp newsletter. That's right, S'more Camp, the inner sanctum. For this kind of show, we do a ton of research. I have different researchers and friends that help me find information, and not everything can make the episode. Either it's like too crazy, it's too like weird or gory, and it will get demonetized on YouTube, or it's just additional and it doesn't always make it, but it always makes it into the S'more Camp Inner Sanctum newsletter. So if you are interested in expanding your mind, learning new information, and being the most interesting person into every room you step into, check it out in the description or this QR code right here. Now let's get back to the show.
In eastern Ukraine, the Ukrainians, in the war in Donbass, they finally get their crap together, and the Ukrainian ground forces start bringing in sufficient firepower. Like all these little Russian insurgencies are creating these people's republics, and these people's mayors are popping up and saying, I'm running this autonomous town and, whichever little locality. And the Ukrainian ground forces, they've expelled the police in a lot of these places, and Ukrainian ground forces basically comes over as a steamroller. And they have setbacks in the beginning. The Russians humiliate them a few times. But by August of 2014, despite all the setbacks in early summer, the insurgency is collapsing. They just don't have enough firepower to confront the Ukrainian ground forces in a real way. They're getting pushed back. Donetsk and Luhansk, the capitals at the center of this insurgency are about to be captured almost entirely, and the leaders of the movement are kind of hiding in their command centers as artillery shells kind of rattle drywall out of their ceilings. And it was, I think, August 15th is when the Russians decide to surge in heavy ground forces to reinforce the dying insurgency. And so the Russians, they have a couple of border crossings from Russia proper, the Rostov-on-Don region, which is where the Southern Military District is for Russia, and that their district headquarters is actually in Rostov-on-Don. And that's the logistic staging point. And they start surging in heavy ground forces to reinforce the surgency. And then they tell the world that these aren't Russian units. These are Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic. They originate from Donetsk and Luhansk, which is, nonsense.
And what is the benefit of that? That you're able to like sort of shirk responsibility for whatever they do by saying it's a local militia that we're not in charge of?
Yeah, essentially they can guard themselves from a degree of public backlash. I don't think anybody really believed them, but some degree of plausible deniability so that we're not responsible for whatever happens, and this is an unfortunate conflict, but we're willing to play the peace broker whenever all the sides agree to come to the negotiating table. It's a fig leaf, but it's a useful fig leaf.
That's interesting. So, I mean, shout out to Mattis for being quick on that response and actually knocking these guys out.
And at least having a good enough relationship with the president that he could be, the president thought he could delegate him those authorities, right? I mean, because we are talking about shooting at Russian, they might be Wagner operatives, but I mean, these are de facto Russian forces.
Wow.
And so that's a massive political liability.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that could go left really easily.
And so that turns out to be the recipe, and Gerasimov was stupid enough to tell him on the phone that these aren't Russians, and we don't, and we're not gonna, and we claim no connection to them.
Yeah, I wonder if that's different when they go, those are Russians. But I guess then he would have to take responsibility and be like, we're not going to tell them to stand down.
Mm-hmm.
In which case, same outcome.
Sure.
And they're on the line for it because it's like, yo, this is your fault. Or then they have to tell them to stand down. So I don't know if they had any other choice, right? You kind of have to say, we don't control them. We don't know what those guys are doing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't see it. Yeah, I don't see any other outcome. I guess maybe you could try to work diplomatically and be like, yeah, I don't know. You'd have to strong arm, I guess, and be like, if you shoot at our guys, then we're going to fire back and we're going to be an all-out war.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a wild.
That was a crazy moment of brinksmanship.
What year was that?
2018.
Wow. And have more moments like that occurred since then into the Ukrainian invasion?
Not really. So the invasion of Ukraine is unique, and one of the reasons the Russians tried to make it a hybrid war, but it was a failure on every way that you can imagine a hybrid war unfolding. So the three terms that the Russians invent around hybrid warfare are maskirovka, which is camouflage, vnyezhepnost, which is surprise, which is essentially that's the speedy maneuver, and then aktivnost, which is all the things that you do to paralyze activities, all the things that you do to paralyze the host nation government. And every three of those, they work pretty well in Georgia. Those three principles are applied pretty well in the Crimean annexation. The vnyezhepnost principle breaks down in the war in Donbass. They just don't. They're working through insurgencies almost entirely, and so there is no speedy maneuver to secure objectives in the way that there could have been. In the Ukraine war, in the Ukrainian invasion in February of 2002, every one of those principles breaks down. So the first thing, we talked about the assassination of Sergei Skripal and the black eye that gave the GRU. Well, the GRU is that they were the ones that masterminded the Georgian war. They were the ones that masterminded the Crimean annexation and the war in Donbass. They're responsible for giving the Russian general staff all the information that they need to plan these military interventions.
But now all of a sudden their main guy gets a dressing down at the Kremlin and then dies in his home a month later.
Right. And so they're on the outs. No one wants to involve them in Russian policy making at this point, and they don't have any credibility with the Kremlin or the other decision makers. So the Kremlin, they give the planning to the FSB. Which is very, very corrupt. And it's, let's just say it would be like, okay, we're going to invade a country, we're going to invade Syria, the United States is, and the FBI is going to be responsible for planning how we invade Syria. Like, how would they have that? How would they be able to do that? Like, what assets does the FBI have to know what information all of the American Brigade combat teams would need in order to facilitate that? How would they, be able to answer the priority information requirements? Like, that's not their job. That's not their institutional role. Like, how could they possibly do that?
Yeah, they would need some crazy intelligence or like just basically refit their entire outfit or something. I don't know.
I don't think it'd be possible. 20 years to flip the organization on its head and completely transform, the missions that the institution supports and how its people are trained before they could adopt that role.
And the FSB had a year?
Yeah, maybe-ish. I think they started taking a potential intervention into Ukraine seriously. They probably already had something on the drawing board. They've probably had something on the drawing board since the 90s. But the Turks surged into Ukraine these, Bayraktar 2 drones. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that Turkish word right, but they're kinetic strike drones similar to our Predators, and they gave them to the Ukrainian ground forces, and so Ukraine was, able to do these drone strikes on the the Donbas militias and Donetsk and Luhansk. And that seems to, that kind of altered the strategic calculus in favor of the Ukrainians. And I think the Russians were worried that they might lose their foothold if the status quo continued to ride forward. And so they started taking some sort of work in Ukraine seriously. The second thing that happened was that Alexander Lukashenko in Belarus had a sham re-election. And he absolutely relied on Russian support to ride out the populist backlash for basically rigging the election and declaring himself Grand Exalted Poobah of Belarus. And he's been there for, I don't know what, 20 years. He's been in charge there for a long time. He's always tried to do a little bit of a balancing act between Moscow and the West. He wants Russia to be an ally, but he doesn't want to be dominated by Moscow, and he doesn't want to have Moscow dictate to him his policies. Well, what Russia has always asked for was the ability to forward stage military forces in Belarus, which, he always said no to. Well, now that he owes his re-election to support from Moscow, he can't say no anymore. And so immediately what that gave Russia the ability to do was stage ground forces on the northern border of Ukraine. First time they've ever been able to do that since the Soviet Union collapsed. So now we're starting to get to a point where an invasion is possible, right? And
Ukraine must know this. Oh, there's reinforcements set up right on the border. That makes us nervous.
Yep. But there's not a lot they can do about it.
Right.
So the next piece that kind of falls into place is the Russians start, or the FSB starts building this, intel packet that tells the Kremlin that, Ukraine's actually very pro-Russian. Volodymyr Zelensky is actually, he's not very popular. He's CIA backed. And all the rhetoric that we're hearing from the Ukrainian ground forces, that's all just propaganda. They're not anti-Russian, and they're not going to fight us in any real way. They expected to capture Ukraine in about 10 days. To give you perspective, Ukraine's about as big as Alaska. The idea that any sizable military force could capture territory of that size in 10 days is nonsense.
Yeah, right? Like, Alaska's pretty big.
Yeah.
I mean, granted, the population is not maybe super dense. I don't know exactly what the population or what the actual armed forces of Ukraine is, but it's a lot of land to cover.
One of the most successful military invasions of all time in a conventional war was the German invasion of Poland. Mm-hmm. And the Wehrmacht was astonishingly competent as a fighting force, which is why they could go toe-to-toe with the world twice, And, they can capture Poland in 10 days.
Right.
Even when Russia the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east. And so they actually sandwiched Poland and divided it in two. Even then, it didn't take 10 days.
So where did this 10 days thing come from? It was just bad intelligence?
It's just them. It was just idiots telling the Kremlin what they wanted to hear. 2 weeks into the invasion of Ukraine, I'm struggling for his name, but the head of the 5th director to the FSB, which is responsible for running foreign agents, that's like the Foreign Intelligence Collection branch of the FSB, even though the FSB is a domestic security agency. And they're the ones for processing that intelligence. That guy was arrested. And there were 2 charges against him. One was incompetence, which was a gross understatement, and the other was basically an interpretation of fraud. And what we can gather from the charges is that he was probably enriching himself from his own covert operations budget. So like all the money he was supposed to be paying to that his operatives in the FSB were supposed to be paying to foreign agents in Ukraine, he was skimming out of that money, or we don't know how much of it.
I mean, he's in a gulag somewhere, right? I mean,
presumably so.
That is That's a crazy fuck around and find out. I mean, that's wild.
Yeah, they'd be like, one of the deputy directors of the CIA, deciding that, well, I'm going to pocket, our operations budget. Like, how the fuck could you do that?
Yeah, especially right before a major like military operation. Like this is, you said 2 weeks before?
It was 2 weeks after the war went off, which means it took Putin 2 weeks to discover that he'd been lied to.
Wow. Oh, that's a fuck up.
So the third issue is that Sergei Shoigu, who was the defense minister at the time, he's moved on since they have a new one named Belyusov. But Sergei Shoigu was one of the most corrupt individuals in the history of Western civilization. Like that man has embezzled so much money out of the Russian Ministry of Defense to support his own personal influence campaigns and his own personal wealth and his own, to make sure that his own political star is rising and to create people that only serve him in positions of influence and power around the Russian government. The reason he was made defense minister was because Putin needed somebody that would not turn the institution against him. And Shoigu happens to not just be a personal friend, but their kids are actually married.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And Shoigu was one of the power brokers in the United Russia Party that actually enabled Putin's rise to power in the first place. So there's no separating them. And so, Putin knew everything he was about. And the hope, I think, from the Kremlin's perspective, was that if you can take a very stalwart and competent and well-respected general like Valery Gerasimov, you make him chief of the general staff, he can check the horrible institutional mismanagement coming from the Minister of Defense. And
yeah,
as it turns out, it doesn't work very well that way.
Yeah. I mean, that just seems like a huge sort of wound kind of in the military infrastructure of Russia that they're trying to like put a Band-Aid on. It's right. Like
he's out now and there's a new one in, and the guy's name is Belyusov, and he was Russia's preeminent economist.
I'm shocked that Putin would tolerate so much like gross incompetence and like borderline, intentional, like corruption. It seems out of character for him that he would prioritize like a personal relationship.
He telegraphs this image of himself as a strong man, but he's not. He is not the second coming of Joseph Stalin. He just tells everybody that he is. And so, he does these like
photo shoots on a horse.
Yeah, where he's like riding around on a horse without a shirt on, or fishing in Siberia without a shirt on.
Yeah, anyone that's doing that kind of makes you think like, oh, they want us to think he is that, which then might indicate, oh, is this a paper tiger?
I will tell you, he is a real judo black belt. He is the Russian judo, they call it Samba, but he's a real black belt. And so like he is a legit martial artist.
Well, fair, but being a martial artist doesn't necessarily mean you're like a real hard-ass dictator, second coming of Stalin. You might just be a, technician that could fuck people up.
So he is Russia's most important power broker, and that's the way to think about him. And he plays factions off of one another, and he creates political alliances, and he maneuvers, but he is not, it's fairly rare for him to just use, raw punching power to, eliminate individuals from institutions. He's not gonna hurt people that are serving him faithfully.
And so that's where this guy kind of comes in, who's a good and faithful servant to Putin.
Yes.
And doesn't get ousted in the right time.
Yep.
Where does he end up going? What does he do with all his riches? And
well, he's buying himself yachts and retirement resorts, and he's probably got himself a couple of tigers.
So he sailed off in the sunset, literally.
I mean, yeah, he's worth billions of dollars, and
yeah, he's chilling. Good for him.
He's on the Russian Security Council now. I think he's the head of the Russian Security Council.
Wow. So I see how these little incompetencies are adding up.
Yeah.
Now, did the actual enforcement of like military exercises and actually putting troops on the border of Ukraine and Belarus, did that make them want to join NATO? Did that influence their NATO decision at all?
Yes. I would say, though, that pretty much like every other country in Eastern Europe, they would join NATO as fast as possible if they could. I mean, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, like the reason they're all NATO members is because they're tiny states, and or let's say Montenegro. And, they realize that if they are not a part of the NATO alliance, then they could get bulldozed by a larger power like Russia.
Right.
This, and Poland is another example. Like the moment that they were able, they joined NATO.
So Ukraine is in the hard spot because they border Russia. Again, they understood for years, hey, if you join NATO, then we're gonna see that as military aggression. So I understand. They've wanted to join for the longest time. They just couldn't because of the sort of leverage put on them by Russia.
There's also a problem of would we accept them, and the idea that we're not going to accept a country who's actively at war with Russia. Like the regime in Washington has been trying to avoid a large scale war with the regime in Moscow since 1945.
Right.
And we're not going to go to war with Russia over Ukraine.
Yeah, and Ukraine is a defensive liability for NATO and for the U.S.
But just like the Russians want a buffer with us, it's good for us to have a buffer with Russia. And that's one of the reasons that the DC Beltway has made the decision to support Ukraine, is because if we allowed Ukraine to collapse, then suddenly we have the potential for a Russian ally to be bordered up against Poland. And so, these little green men that popped up in the Crimean Peninsula, or the crap that they pulled in Georgia with, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, they tried that crap in Poland. The Poles would kill all of them. The Poles are having none of it. And if little green men started popping up in Warsaw, that's the pathway for NATO to go. Poland
That's real go time.
Yeah, that's real go time. Poland would pull up Article 5 of the NATO Charter and call the rest of NATO into war with Russia. The way we've seen Russian ground forces perform at this point seems to suggest that NATO in a conventional war, NATO forces would run over them very quickly. It would be a rout. Russia they're an artillery-based force. They can do kind of a slow steamroller conventional war approach that's very reminiscent of the old Soviet tactics. The NATO forces would bring air power to bear. We would, strike their air defense systems and knock those out with, advanced fighters that are undetectable by radar, and that would be the first couple of days. And then once those things are out, it would be a rout because it would be, we'd basically be target practice from the air.
What's the concern with that as a military strategy?
It creates a very dangerous Jacob's ladder, because if you had, if let's say we had a conventional war with Russia in Poland, something like that, the Russian army would get routed very quickly, and that would create a regime destabilizing rout. And so if you're Moscow, you can't let that happen. The only thing to do is to escalate, and the only way to escalate is in the nuclear domain. And that means bringing out tactical nuclear ordnance in order to shore up your conventional forces' shortcomings. And that is the pathway to a general nuclear exchange.
And Russia knows this, which kind of gives them a little bit more confidence to say, hey, we have overall leverage. We don't want nuclear war. They don't want nuclear war, but we have the capability to do that. So if we exercise this military strategy in Ukraine, maybe we can fold them over in 10 days. We have some bad intelligence, da-da-da-da. And I can see how we get into this position now.
Yeah.
Where they think like, oh, if we get into Poland, I don't think they want that. We can find some type of diplomatic negotiation because neither one of us would want nuclear war.
They definitely know it's on our mind, which is why they're doing some of this nuclear saber rattling. One of the things that's troubled me the most is that they've withdrawn from the START agreements, which were the basis for all of our nuclear negotiations with Moscow. They've been violating our intermediate nuclear forces agreements for a long time, but now we finally said, okay, if you we were willing to renegotiate, provided the Chinese would also join the negotiations, and the Chinese are having none of it. So we just told the Russians, well, look, you're already not in compliance with the old ones, so we're not doing this.
Wow. That's concerning.
Well, it's concerning. I'm not sure that there was another choice on the table. But what really troubles me is that the Russians have withdrawn from START. And that was the basis for almost every diplomatic, taunt that we had with them, especially the nuclear stuff. We're not going to get them back to the negotiating table until whatever is done in Ukraine is done. And they're so angry at us right now that they'll hardly talk to us. The thing I would say is we don't want the regime in Kiev to collapse, and that's important. We do want to buffer with Russia. And that's important. That we definitely don't want them to ever be on the border with Poland.
Yeah, that's bang time.
Yeah. I'm quite worried about the Turks ever firing a shot in anger at the Russians. They compete over the Black Sea. They compete over the Caucasus region. All those countries in the Caucasus, they're all ethnically Turkish. Georgian that's a dialect of Turkish. And the Turks have a very sophisticated army. It's the second largest army in NATO. Their army is over 400,000 troops.
Oh wow!
They have quite a sophisticated air force.
So it could be a similar situation in Poland.
Yeah,
in the sense that they're ready to go.
And yeah, the Turks, they, unlike the rest of NATO, almost all of Europe has an inverted demography now. There are more people that are old and retiring than there are young people in the workforce. And that's a real problem if you're trying to, fill out the army with, a bunch of young men, right? Because, that's all people you're pulling out of the workforce. Well, the Turks, they have a traditionalist Muslim population that, has lots of children. And they've got a very robust, very young demography that's only growing and expanding. And that creates a lot of young men that might have a future unless you could put them into the armed forces. And so their military ranks are full. They're very well trained. They're trained in NATO standards. And I pity the country that picks a fight with Turkey. That will not end well for anybody.
And has there been saber rattling from Russia? And, is it mostly proxy war over countries that are ethnically Turkish?
Yeah, it's proxy wars. The big proxy war that they've had is in Libya.
Mm.
So the Russians want to dominate oil and gas production from Libya because that's oil and gas going to Europe that's not coming from Russia, and they want to make sure that the Europeans have to come to Moscow for their fuel needs, right? And so they've involved themselves with one faction in the Libyan civil war to try to slant the outcome in their way. The Turks have involved themselves with the other faction, and the Turks are they're trying to make it go their way. And this recent Nagorno-Karabakh conflict in Azerbaijan and Armenia. So this was an ethnically Armenian enclave in Azerbaijan that Armenia has occupied for a long time, and Azerbaijan basically annexed it. And that was all done. Azerbaijan they're very incompetent as far as the military force goes. Well, it was Turkish officers that came in and trained them and actually ran their ground forces. And so the Turks were the reason that was able to happen.
The Turks just don't leave Armenia alone, dude. They just keep on going at it, bro. Wow.
Yeah, they don't even talk about.
About what?
What is Armenia?
Talk about what? There's nothing to talk about.
Yeah.
What do you mean? We don't acknowledge anything.
Yeah. Anybody that gets into a war with Turkey deserves what's going to happen to them.
Wow. I had no idea that they had so much military power.
They've got a lot of military power. Poland's number 2 with, I think I told you, 6 divisions that they could deploy to a war immediately. And France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, who we consider as like the principal powers in Europe, they're each running 3 division armed forces. Germany is acutely aware of their history. And for that reason, the ministry or, their defense, apparatus is completely outside of public policy making. Like, that's the backwater. You can guarantee that your career isn't going to go anywhere, and you're not going to be significant in government if you worked in defense. They do not want the defense establishment setting policy in Germany.
Is it because of embarrassment from World War II?
Yeah, they want to make sure that nothing like that ever happens again, quite frankly. So the other piece of that is that they manage the Bundeswehr with a certain degree of deliberate incompetence. A lot of the Bundeswehr was not really, it was moribund, it's under-maintained. There are artillery batteries where, majority of the artillery pieces don't fire. The units are understaffed. The Germans could credibly field maybe a single brigade within about a month, provided that brigade was allowed to cannibalize parts and personnel from the mother division. And that's the way the Germans want it. The French can, it takes them, they could field a couple of battalions, let's say a combined arms battalion, and then maybe a light infantry battalion within a week, and then they could probably field a brigade within a month. They would be very well armed, very well trained, but they would kind of be threadbare. They've just got a limited budget, and the French forces have been at war in Africa for years, and they've shown us, one, that they're very competent, they're very well trained, they are not afraid to stack up bodies. They don't have rules of engagement like we do, and
the French don't.
No, the French will lay some people out. The French, when they fight insurgencies in Mali, if a French soldier pulls a trigger, there is nobody in the French officer class or the government that is going to ask questions.
Wow,
they are. No, but they've also, I think those are privileges that American soldiers would drool over. They're always worried that somebody is going to question them and they're going to get hauled in front of a tribunal for making a bad choice at some point, right?
Right.
But the French have also kind of demonstrated in all their Africa operations that the way to a resolution of the conflict is not in being able to kill more of the enemy. This was a lesson that we learned in Vietnam. Lyndon B. Johnson was the one that kept trying to figure out, like, how do we kill more Vietnamese? And, we got to kill more Viet Cong. We got to kill more Viet Cong. You guys just aren't killing the enemy. You got to, and the French are kind of proving that again, that you can't defeat insurgency necessarily through attrition. They'll keep coming back. There's always that population, if they hate you, will keep producing young men.
This idea, you'll never kill the idea.
Yeah, you'll never kill the idea, and the more people you kill, the more you're going to make the community hate you. So they've demonstrated that in Africa, but nevertheless, they're very competent fighting troops. And then there's the British, and the British have a 3-division army. 6th division is it's a division full of boutique units that all have very niche mission sets. That's where their Army Special Operations Brigade is. That's where their like informations operations is. That's where their military intelligence stuff is. 3rd Brigade is their heavy combat power. That's where their tank division, or that's where their tank brigade is, and their armored brigades. And then 1st Division is their rapidly deployable forces. That's where the 18th Airborne Brigade Combat Team is, and a couple of other, let's say, high readiness units that can deploy and get to a crisis quickly. The problem for the UK is they're very well trained, they're very well led, and let's say they're all at a high state of readiness, like their kit and equipment's in pretty good repair. The problem is that as an economy, the British they're quite taxed in their capacity to support a conflict on the continent, and their current state of economic malaise is limited. The spirit is willing, but their government just can't afford to do a lot of things that they want to do.
Partially due to Brexit?
Partially. There's a much larger conversation to be had about economics. the Tories have not delivered on any of the reforms that they were elected to implement in 2010, and which is why they were completely routed by Labor. The caveat to that is that the Labor government is kind of illegitimate in its own right, even though they've won an unprecedented supermajority, because this is the lowest voter turnout in Great Britain in history. The reason the Labor won in such a dramatic fashion was because all the people that had put the Tories in power became so angry and disillusioned that they just didn't vote. And so Labor has won these historic gains. And so even though they have this unprecedented supermajority, whatever solutions they deliver, it's solutions that the majority of the public didn't vote for.
Because the turnout is so low.
The turnout was so low, and it's because people in the UK are so disillusioned with their political process right now.
Wow.
So that's its own conversation.
Yeah. So as far as a war in Europe, the sort of ranks as far as like who is able to bang right now would be Poland,
Turkey,
France, England. Anyone else? I mean, some honorable mentions here and there from, I'm sure, German forces. And
Sweden just became, Sweden and Finland just joined NATO. And Sweden is the first country to join NATO in a very long time that is a net defense contributor rather than a consumer. But they're not a contributor in terms of heavy ground forces. They have significant air power, and they have a very well-trained Navy. And one of the things that the Arctic countries, or the Scandinavian countries are offering to the rest of the NATO alliance now is they're saying, hey, look, we know the Russians are very active in the Arctic right now, and that's something that's causing everybody some concern. Don't worry about it. We got this.
That's nice.
That is nice. And Sweden is one of those countries that is a net contributor, and their Navy and, their Navy working with Norway and with Finland and with Denmark, and to maybe to a lesser extent the British, like they have much they can contribute, but it's not in heavy ground forces. Smaller countries like Denmark, for example, like the Danes they're militarily insignificant, but it's always kind of been that way because they're a peninsula, but really they're kind of an island almost. Like they're no one's going to invade Denmark from the land,
right?
They actually work very closely with the Royal Marines. It's like if you actually look at how the British Royal Marines are structured, there is a Danish complement within the British Royal Marines that just accepts British command and control, and that's how the Danes punch above their weight, and that's how the British help round out their numbers.
Interesting. This is a little off topic. Do you know anything about Kadyrov?
Kadyrov? Mm-mm.
He's like I don't want to call him a warlord, but he's sort of like a military leader and sort of an apparatus of Putin, I think, in Dagestan. Are you familiar with his name at all?
No.
I'll send you some articles on him. He's a really interesting character. It's completely off topic. I wasn't sure if you would have heard of him before. I don't know like how broad his reach is, but I've just heard some interesting stories I can tell you later about this character and how he fits into like the Russian geopolitical game. It's on this kind of topic here. Where did Zelensky come from?
He was a comedian.
Right. Yeah. Like that's how I understand him to be. Like, oh, he's a comedian, he's an actor, he's well known, and then he plays a president in a TV show and then becomes the president and then is also like this fierce leader that's just like loved by the Ukrainian people. Is that a fair narrative, or is there some other type of is he just a puppet of the United States? Like what exactly is going on?
Well, as given your professional choices, you can probably appreciate this better than most people, right? The role of the comedian, or or maybe we can go back further and say the role of the court jester, so to speak, right? Is to draw attention to things that no one can draw attention to, and the whole art form is remarking on the paradoxes that don't necessarily make sense, and that's why they make us laugh. Right. He was a critic of the regime. He was a critic of policy for a long time. It quite frankly, it'd be like if somebody was just like, Hey, I really liked that stand-up show. Have you ever thought of running for Congress? And maybe that could happen. I don't know if if maybe there's a political party winking at you, but
One day.
that's what happened with Zelensky essentially, and as a critic, he started to gain political notoriety, and he ran for president and he won it. And then, he was actually this is the Russians should not, and I'm sure they know this now, but like they really, really stepped on their crank when they invaded Ukraine, because Zelensky's presidency was really on the rocks before, they invaded in February 24th, 2022. And Zelensky was in a hard position. Like he was trying to institute reforms. He had promised the Ukrainian people that he was going to join the European Union and he was going to end the war in Donbass. And he was way behind in instituting reforms, and a lot of that was because there's a pro-Russian segment of the Ukrainian parliament that wants to frustrate that process. But there's also tons of oligarchs around Ukraine that don't want their pocketbooks lightened. And when you change the status quo, you upset a lot of people. And so he was really struggling, and his legitimacy was on the decline. And then the Russians invaded, and suddenly, he shows up in all these macho videos telling the West, look, I don't need a ride out of the country. I need ammo. And he looks like a Winston Churchill kind of hero. And it builds this legend around the man. And so he's got, 80% approval ratings now. And he's powerful enough now that he can fire Ukrainian generals and no one, or the defense minister, and he can make, rearrangements in the government, and no one's going to fight back or question his judgment, which was never the case. Like like Petro Poroshenko, who was interim president for a while, he didn't have that kind of power. The Russians created that monster. And if they had just left Ukraine alone, he probably he
would have been outed, and
eventually he would have lost re-election.
Wow.
And instead they created him.
He became like a living martyr in a way. Like they made a war hero.
Yep. That's a great way to say it, a living martyr.
Wow. That is so interesting. And
the fact that he's a comedian really helps him. Like when he gives speeches, he's very good, and you can probably appreciate the skill set.
Great performer.
You have to look at people and understand how they're reacting to what you're saying, and then adjust your words, right? And he's got that skill set, and it's so I don't know. Maybe you should run for Congress.
Maybe I should. If you know some people in the State Department, tell them to call me. Okay. yeah. I'll do it. Whatever they need. I want to be CIA. That'd be my dream job. To be completely honest, to be an asset and then go around, do comedy around the world. Do some pods, talk to people, but all the while, I'm an agent. Working for the U.S.
What if they made you get a haircut? Would that?
No, whoa. Well, I'm out. I'm out. Yeah, I'm out. I'm not doing all that shit. You got to wait till it falls out.
There you go.
And then maybe we'll look into it. Curtis, this has been awesome, dude. I feel like I'm not as dumb as when we started. I feel like I've figured some things out. In your book, Hybrid Warfare, how much more of this conversation do you delve into? I mean, all the details. Is there a lot more in the book that we haven't discussed?
I tell you what, there's nuances and details in how the Russian Special Operations Forces are run that I'd love to be able to dive in more on. There's the epilogue is all about the current war in Ukraine, and it's about how it fell apart. It's about what the Russians saw. It's about their failure to institute defense reforms. And there's a really good chapter that features an old Russian defense minister, Anatoly Serdyukov. And Serdyukov is, he was ousted for corruption, which is ironic. He was implicated in the Magnitsky scandal. But he was a real reformer, and what he was doing was he was a tax officer, and he was brought in to run the Ministry of Defense, and he set up all of these financial control boards that forced the general staff to account for every single ruble that they spent. And so by magic, from 2008 forward, all of these Russian defense programs started yielding fruit. Like all of these procurement programs actually started delivering new, MiG-29 fighters and tanks.
You track where the money goes. All of a sudden, you start getting the shit you pay for.
So these Russian generals started walking to finance meetings like they were walking to the scaffold. And he implemented this program with his generals where like they were fighting him publicly and trying to embarrass him. And so he would make the generals run a PT test, a military PT test. And when they would, these are guys in their 50s and 60s.
And you'd make them do laps?
And they're chronic alcoholics and they have to learn how to jog again to keep their job. And he would fire them the moment they failed these tests.
Oh, what badass. That's awesome.
And he eventually replaces all of the deputy defense minister positions with tax professionals. And the department starts to they build these two giant military procurement programs, GPV 2020 and then GPV 2027. I've got they're on the book website. I go into detail on both of them. So they're procuring new ships, new planes, new tanks, electronic warfare systems. They're investing in the S-400 missile, air defense system. And then he gets implicated in the Magnitsky scandal, and all of his enemies within the Ministry of Defense pounce on him to try to force him out before he can go any further in reform. Putin allows it to happen for whatever reason, and he eventually gets replaced with Sergei Shoigu, and Shoigu basically takes those headline procurement programs and shows those to the public as evidence that the Russian Ministry of Defense is really, really changing, and it's this, high-performing thing now. And he fools us. Like the Western, all the Western governments really believed that Russia was running the world's second most powerful military. But there was rot underneath the paint. And, the longer Shoigu was in charge, the worse it got.
Wow.
And so that's all in there. And I go deep into their defense reforms. I go into how they restructure the officer corps, the fights that they have about creating a non-commissioned officer corps, their military academies, and all sorts of stuff.
I mean, this is awesome. I think this conversation also sets up a lot of the understanding. Like if you could track this, which for me, I'm pretty dumb. And I feel like I was able to track everything you were saying. So I feel like I'm actually set up to understand the book a lot easier because I have a general understanding of what hybrid warfare is. I understand sort of the tools that are being used and sort of the main players that are using them. So I feel like I'll be able to read this and it's not going to be, too dense for someone dense like me. That's the hope.
Well, don't be too hard on yourself. But I've told my cousins and stuff, like if you read it, it'll help you get to sleep.
This is the kind of shit I like though. So this is awesome. I'm actually, a lot of times people come on and talk about different books and I'm always like, maybe I'll peruse through it, but I'm going to 100% go through this. Thank you so much for the time, brother. I really appreciate it.
Hey,
this
man,
was
it's been a pleasure.
awesome. Let's do it again soon. All right.
Thanks for having me.